Krieg occupied a position of considerable strategic value within the Segmentum Tempestus for millennia, before its name became synonymous with nuclear devastation and suicidal infantry charges. Located in the relatively stable region of space that benefited from established warp routes and proximity to other productive systems, the planet served the Imperium as a thriving hive world whose industrial capacity fed the ever-grinding war machine of humanity's galactic empire. The world's surface bore the characteristic sprawling hive cities that reached kilometers into the ash-gray skies, their foundations burrowing equally deep into the planetary crust, where vast mining operations extracted the raw materials that would be processed in the manufactorums above. The planet's importance to the Imperium stemmed not from any single exceptional quality, but from its reliable productivity across multiple sectors of military manufacturing. Krieg's foundries produced everything from standard pattern lasguns and flak armor to the more complex components required for armored vehicles and artillery pieces. The world maintained production quotas that satisfied the Adeptus Munitorum's demands without requiring constant intervention from the Administratum, a rare quality that allowed the planet to operate with a degree of autonomy unusual for hive worlds of its classification. Munitions production represented Krieg's primary output, with chemical plants converting the planet's mineral wealth into promethium, explosives, and the various propellants required by the Imperial Guard's countless regiments across the Segmentum. The autocracy of Krieg governed the planet through a rigid hierarchical structure that concentrated power within the hands of a relatively small ruling class. These autocrats controlled the major hive cities and their associated industrial complexes, each maintaining their own private military forces and competing for influence within the planetary government. The system functioned through a council of autocrats who met in the capital Hive to coordinate planetary affairs, manage tithe obligations, and settle disputes between the various power blocks. This arrangement had persisted for centuries, creating an entrenched aristocracy whose positions passed through hereditary succession and whose wealth derived from the exploitation of Krieg's industrial capacity. Below the autocrats existed a sprawling bureaucratic apparatus that managed the day-to-day operations of the hives. Overseers controlled individual manufactorums, mine bosses directed the extraction operations, and countless clerks tracked production figures, worker assignments, and resource allocation. The vast majority of Krieg's population occupied the lowest rungs of this hierarchy, working 12-hour shifts in the foundries and factories, living in cramped hab blocks that housed thousands of workers in conditions that prioritized efficiency over comfort. The workers received their rations from planetary stores, their children were assigned to work details based on aptitude testing, and their lives followed predictable patterns dictated by production schedules that never ceased. The imperial cult maintained a significant presence on Krieg, though its expression took on characteristics shaped by the planet's industrial culture. The ecclesiarchy's priests preached sermons that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the emperor's expectation that every citizen contribute their labor to humanity's survival. Cathedral factories combined places of worship with production facilities, allowing workers to offer prayers during shift changes and hear sermons broadcast through Vox systems while they worked. The faith practiced on Krieg stressed that service to the Imperium represented the highest form of devotion to the God Emperor, and that productive labor constituted a form of prayer. This interpretation suited both the planetary government and the Administratum, as it reinforced the work ethic necessary to maintain Krieg's impressive output. The planet's cultural characteristics reflected its industrial foundation. Krieger society valued punctuality, precision, and adherence to established procedures. Children learned to read using technical manuals and production schedules. Entertainment consisted primarily of state-approved broadcasts that detailed the Imperium's military victories and the importance of maintaining production quotas. Art existed in the form of propaganda posters celebrating industrial achievement and military service. The population understood their role within the greater imperial machine, and most accepted this reality without question, having known no alternative existence. Krieg's productive capacity made it valuable enough that the administratum paid attention when production figures fluctuated or tithe deliveries arrived late. The planet had maintained centuries of reliable service, consistently meeting its obligations and occasionally exceeding them during periods of particular efficiency. This track record earned Krieg a measure of trust from the distant bureaucrats on Terra who reviewed the endless streams of data flowing from thousands of worlds. The planet functioned as the Imperium intended, transforming raw materials and human labor into the weapons and equipment required to prosecute humanity's endless wars. The seeds of Krieg's civil war germinated in the decades preceding 433 in the 40th millennium, though the full scope of the separatist movement remained hidden from imperial authorities until open rebellion erupted. The administratum's decision to increase Krieg's tithe obligations represented the immediate catalyst, but the underlying tensions had been building within the planetary government for generations. The increased demands came following a comprehensive audit of Krieg's production capacity, which determined that the planet's output had grown substantially over the previous centuries, while its tithe rates had remained static. From the administratum's perspective, this represented a simple correction to ensure Krieg contributed its fair share to the imperial war effort. The autocrats viewed the situation differently. They had invested enormous resources into expanding Krieg's industrial capacity, constructing new manufactorums, sinking deeper mine shafts, and implementing efficiency improvements that increased output without proportional increases in resource consumption. These investments had enriched the ruling class, allowing them to accumulate wealth and power that exceeded what their ancestors had possessed. The increased tithe demands threatened to consume the profits from these improvements, effectively punishing the autocrats for their success and reducing their economic position to what it had been centuries earlier. A faction within the autocracy began advocating for resistance to the new tithe rates. These separatists argued that Krieg had fulfilled its obligations to the Imperium for millennia and deserved recognition of its autonomy rather than increased exploitation. They pointed to other worlds within the Segmentum Tempestus that maintained lower tithe rates despite comparable industrial capacity, suggesting that Krieg suffered discrimination from the administratum. The separatist rhetoric emphasized Krieg's self-sufficiency and military production capability, noting that the planet possessed the means to defend itself against any attempt at forcible compliance with the new tithe demands. The separatist movement gained support among significant portions of the autocracy, particularly among younger autocrats who had inherited their positions more recently and felt less bound by traditional loyalty to Terra. These individuals controlled substantial private military forces, equipped with weapons and vehicles produced in their own manufactorums. They began coordinating their efforts, holding secret meetings to discuss strategy and building alliances across the various Hive cities. The movement remained carefully hidden from imperial authorities, with tithe shipments continuing as scheduled, while the separatists prepared for eventual confrontation. Loyalist autocrats recognized the danger in the separatist position. These individuals understood that rebellion against the administratum's tithe demands constituted treason against the Imperium itself, regardless of the justifications offered. They argued within the autocracy's councils that Krieg's obligations to the Emperor superseded any local concerns about profit margins or autonomy. The Loyalists maintained their own military forces and began their own preparations, anticipating that the separatists would eventually move beyond rhetoric to action. The planetary government fractured along these lines, with each Hive city's leadership declaring for one faction or the other, though some attempted to maintain neutrality in the hope that compromise might still be achieved. The imperial authorities stationed on Krieg initially remained unaware of the depth of the crisis developing within the planetary government. The administratum's representatives continued receiving production reports and tithe shipments on schedule. The small contingent of Imperial Guard troops garrisoning the planet noticed nothing unusual in their routine interactions with local authorities. The Arbites precinct fortresses detected increased activity among the autocrats' private military forces, but attributed this to normal competition between the ruling houses rather than preparation for system-wide conflict. The rejection of the administratum's increased tithe demands came not through any single dramatic declaration, but through a coordinated refusal by the separatist-controlled hives to implement the new rates. When the administratum's representatives arrived to inspect facilities and verify compliance with the updated tithe schedules, they found themselves denied access to separatist-controlled sectors. Attempts to enforce imperial authority met with armed resistance from the autocrats' military forces. The separatists issued statements claiming they would continue honoring the previous tithe rates, but would not accept what they characterized as unjust increases that failed to account for Krieg's centuries of loyal service and the investments made to expand productive capacity. The loyalist autocrats immediately declared the separatists traitors and called for imperial intervention to restore proper authority. They mobilized their own forces and began seizing control of strategic locations within their hives, arresting known separatist sympathizers and securing critical infrastructure. The separatists responded in kind, and within weeks Krieg descended into open civil war as the two factions fought for control of the planet. The conflict began with skirmishes between private military forces in the underhives, and quickly escalated to full-scale battles involving armor and artillery, as both sides committed their full strength to the struggle. The formal outbreak of the Krieg Civil War in 433 of the 40th millennium caught the wider Imperium unprepared despite the weeks of escalating violence that preceded it. The separatists had spent years positioning their forces and securing control of key infrastructure, giving them overwhelming advantages when hostilities commenced in earnest. The traitor autocrats controlled approximately 70% of Krieg's hive cities, including the capital and most of the planet's major industrial centers. Their private armies had been expanded and equipped using the very manufactorums that should have been producing weapons for the imperial tithe, creating a substantial military force that dwarfed the loyalist contingents in both numbers and materiel. The separatists' most critical advantage came from their control of Krieg's orbital defense platforms and the system's monitoring stations. These installations had been seized in coordinated strikes during the first hours of the rebellion, with separatist forces overwhelming the small Imperial Navy detachments that crewed them. The traitors executed most of the Imperial personnel immediately, while others were imprisoned in the deep holds of the orbital fortresses. This control of the high orbitals meant that any Imperial response would face significant obstacles before relief forces could even reach the planet's surface. The defense lasers and missile batteries that should have protected Krieg from Xeno's raiders now pointed their weapons at potential loyalist reinforcements, effectively isolating the planet from outside intervention. The loyalist forces found themselves in a desperate strategic position from the war's beginning. Colonel Jerton of the 83rd Krieg Regiment, the highest-ranking Imperial Guard officer on the planet, assumed command of the loyalist military effort after the separatists assassinated the planetary governor and most of his staff in the opening days of the conflict. Jerton commanded approximately 3 million soldiers when combining the loyalist autocrats' private armies with the Imperial Guard garrison forces, a substantial force by most standards, but woefully inadequate against the separatists' estimated 20 million troops. The traitors possessed superior numbers in every category of military equipment, controlling the majority of Krieg's armor production facilities and artillery foundries. The initial engagements demonstrated the scale of the loyalists' disadvantage. Separatist forces launched coordinated offensives against loyalist-held hives, bringing overwhelming firepower to bear against defensive positions that lacked adequate supplies or reinforcement. The Battle of Farograd Hive exemplified the pattern that would repeat across Krieg during these early months. Separatist armor columns numbering over 2,000 vehicles surrounded the hive, while artillery batteries subjected the outer districts to sustained bombardment. The loyalist defenders, numbering perhaps 100,000 troops with minimal armor support, held their positions for 3 weeks before separatist forces breached the outer walls and began fighting through the hab blocks and manufactorums. The urban combat that characterized the Battle of Ferrograd showcased the brutal efficiency of the separatist military machine. Their forces advanced methodically through the Hive levels, using massed infantry supported by tanks and combat engineers to clear each sector. The Loyalists fought desperately, turning every corridor into a killing ground and fortifying industrial facilities to create strongpoints that required sustained assault to reduce. Civilians caught in the combat zones died in enormous numbers, as artillery fire collapsed hab blocks and street fighting transformed residential areas into corpse-strewn ruins. The separatists showed no mercy to loyalist soldiers or civilians, executing prisoners and implementing scorched earth tactics in captured sectors to prevent any possibility of counterattack. Jurton recognized within the first months that conventional military operations could not reverse the Loyalists' deteriorating position. Separatist forces captured Hive after Hive, systematically reducing Loyalist territory through campaigns that combined numerical superiority with competent tactical execution. The traitors controlled the supply lines, the production facilities, and the transportation networks. Every week of fighting weakened the Loyalist forces, while the Separatists could replace their losses from their vast reserves of manpower and equipment. Simple mathematics indicated that the Loyalist cause would collapse within a year unless something fundamental changed in the strategic situation. The Loyalist forces retreated toward the southern polar regions of Krieg, consolidating their remaining strength in a cluster of hives that maintained some industrial capacity and possessed defensible approaches. Jurton established his headquarters in Ferrograd South, one of the few major hives that remained under Loyalist control. The colonel spent his days reviewing casualty reports that showed his forces bleeding away in a war of attrition they could not win, studying maps that displayed shrinking pockets of Loyalist territory, and reading intelligence assessments that confirmed the Separatists were preparing a final offensive to eliminate organized resistance. The strategic reality facing Jurton offered no conventional solutions. The orbital blockade prevented any possibility of Imperial reinforcement reaching the surface in sufficient strength to alter the military balance. Even if a relief fleet somehow fought through the defense platforms, the Separatists would control most of the planet and could potentially negotiate from a position of strength. The traitor autocrats had already begun sending messages to neighboring systems, claiming they had overthrown a corrupt planetary government and offering to maintain trade relationships and honor existing contracts. Some merchant cartels showed interest in these overtures, seeing profit opportunities in dealing with Krieg's new rulers regardless of their political legitimacy. Jurton possessed one advantage that the Separatists had overlooked in their planning. The southern hive complexes included several military installations that housed Krieg's strategic weapons stockpiles. The planet's role as a munitions producer meant it maintained substantial reserves of atomic warheads, biological weapons, and chemical agents intended for use against the Imperium's enemies. These weapons remained under Loyalist control because the Separatists had not considered them relevant to the Civil War. Conventional military doctrine held that strategic weapons had no application in conflicts where both sides occupied the same planet, as their use would destroy the very territory being contested. The colonel began considering options that transcended conventional doctrine. His staff officers initially recoiled when Jurton first proposed using the strategic weapons against separatist-held territory. The immediate objections focused on the obvious consequences of deploying atomic weapons across Krieg's surface. The death toll would measure in the billions. The hive cities would become irradiated ruins. The planet's industrial capacity would be destroyed, eliminating the productive value that made Krieg worth fighting over in the first place. The environmental devastation would render vast regions of the planet uninhabitable for centuries. Jurton listened to these objections and acknowledged their validity before presenting his counterargument. Krieg under separatist control represented a productive world in rebellion against the Imperium, its industrial output serving traitors who rejected the Emperor's authority. The planet's manufactorums would produce weapons for the separatist armies, its foundries would forge armor for traitor forces, and its resources would fuel a rebellion that could inspire similar movements on other worlds. The Administratum's authority would be diminished, and the Imperium would lose access to Krieg's production entirely. Alternatively, Krieg transformed into an irradiated wasteland offered nothing to the separatists. The traitors would inherit a dead world, their victory rendered meaningless by the destruction of everything they fought to control. The strategic logic supporting Jurton's position rested on the principle of denial. If the Loyalists could not hold Krieg for the Imperium, they could at least ensure the separatists gained nothing from their treason. The atomic weapons provided the means to implement this strategy, transforming the planet into a battlefield where neither side could survive, but where the Loyalists could claim a form of victory through the complete negation of the separatist cause. Jurton framed his proposal in terms of duty and sacrifice, arguing that the Loyalist forces had an obligation to prevent Krieg's resources from serving the enemies of the Emperor, regardless of the cost. The colonel's staff remained divided on the proposal, with some officers supporting the plan as the only viable option, while others argued for continued conventional resistance in hope that Imperial reinforcements might eventually arrive. Jurton resolved the debate through the authority of his rank and his position as the senior Imperial commander on Krieg. He issued orders to prepare the strategic weapons for deployment, designating primary targets in the major separatist-held hives and secondary targets across industrial centers and military installations. The weapons would be delivered through multiple means, including ballistic missiles from the southern launch complexes, strategic bombers flying from Loyalist air bases, and pre-positioned demolition charges in facilities that Loyalist saboteurs could still access. The preparation phase required several weeks as munitions specialists armed the warheads and programmed targeting coordinates into the missile guidance systems. Bomber crews received their mission briefings and began planning flight routes that would maximize their chances of reaching their targets before separatist air defenses could respond. Sabotage teams infiltrated separatist territory, carrying compact atomic devices that could be positioned in critical infrastructure locations. The Loyalist forces maintained their defensive operations during this period, giving no indication of the apocalyptic strike being prepared in the southern hives. Jurton issued the launch order in the early hours of a morning that would mark the end of Krieg as a living world. The missiles lifted from their silos in coordinated salvos, their contrails drawing white lines across the gray skies as they arced toward their targets. Strategic bombers departed their bases in formations that would deliver additional warheads to secondary targets. The separatist forces detected the launches within minutes, their sensor arrays tracking the missiles' trajectories and identifying their targets. The traitor commanders initially assumed they faced a conventional missile strike and ordered their air defenses to engage the incoming warheads, not yet understanding the nature of the weapons racing toward their cities. The first atomic detonations occurred over the capital Hive, where 3 warheads airbursted at optimal altitude to maximize the destruction across the sprawling urban complex. The nuclear fireballs expanded outward, their thermal radiation incinerating everything within the initial blast radius. The pressure waves that followed collapsed the towering Hive spires, crushing millions of people beneath falling rockcrete and twisted metal. Secondary fires ignited across the city as promethium storage tanks ruptured and chemical plants exploded. The electromagnetic pulses from the detonations disabled electronic systems across hundreds of kilometers, plunging the Hive into darkness as power grids failed and Vox networks went silent. Additional strikes followed in rapid succession across every major separatist-held Hive. Farograd Hive, which the separatists had captured months earlier at such cost, vanished beneath multiple nuclear detonations that transformed the city into a crater of radioactive glass. Industrial centers disappeared in atomic fire as warheads targeted the manufactorums and foundries that had been producing weapons for the traitor armies. Military installations received precision strikes that eliminated command facilities and equipment depots. The strategic bombers added their payloads to the destruction, dropping their weapons on targets that the missiles had missed or that required additional firepower to ensure complete elimination. The biological and chemical weapons deployment began in the hours following the initial atomic strikes. artillery batteries in loyalist territory fired shells loaded with toxins and pathogens into the irradiated ruins, ensuring that any survivors of the nuclear genocide would face additional threats. Sabotage teams activated their demolition charges in water treatment facilities and atmospheric processors, releasing chemical agents that would contaminate the air and water supplies in regions that had escaped direct nuclear attack. The biological weapons included engineered plagues designed to persist in the environment and infect any population that attempted to reoccupy contaminated areas. The separatist response came too late to prevent the destruction, but demonstrated their fury at Jurton's actions. Traitor forces launched their own missile strikes against the loyalist hives, though they employed conventional warheads rather than matching the atomic assault. Separatist armies began forced marches toward loyalist territory, determined to exact revenge for the billions of their supporters who had died in the nuclear fires. The traitor autocrats who survived the initial strikes issued proclamations declaring Jurton and all loyalist forces guilty of genocide, and promising that every loyalist would be hunted down and executed for their crimes against Krieg's people. The environmental consequences of the atomic bombardment manifested within days. Radioactive fallout began settling across the planet's surface, carried by atmospheric currents that distributed contamination far beyond the immediate strike zones. The nuclear winter effect commenced as particulate matter from the explosions blocked sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet and killing what little vegetation existed on Krieg's already heavily industrialized surface. The planet's weather patterns destabilized, creating toxic storms that combined radioactive dust with chemical agents to produce precipitation that poisoned everything it touched. The death toll exceeded all projections. The initial atomic strikes killed approximately 4 billion people instantly, vaporizing those closest to the detonations and crushing or burning those further away. The collapse of the hive cities killed billions more as entire urban complexes crumbled into rubble that buried their populations. The fallout and environmental contamination claimed additional billions in the weeks and months that followed, as radiation sickness, starvation, and exposure killed survivors who had escaped the immediate destruction. The biological weapons added their own casualties as plagues spread through refugee populations attempting to flee the devastated hives. Both the loyalist and separatist military forces suffered catastrophic losses. The separatist armies lost the majority of their strength in the nuclear strikes that targeted their hive cities and military installations. Entire divisions vanished in atomic fire, their equipment melted into slag, and their personnel reduced to shadows burned into rockcrete walls. The loyalist forces fared little better, as their own hives became targets for separatist retaliation, and the environmental devastation affected all of Krieg's surface. Jurton's southern strongholds survived the initial exchange, but faced the same radioactive fallout and environmental collapse that consumed the rest of the planet. The survivors on both sides retreated into whatever shelter they could find. The deep underhives offered some protection from the radiation and toxic atmosphere, though these regions quickly became overcrowded as refugees flooded into the tunnels and lower levels. The remaining military forces established defensive positions in the ruins, using rubble and collapsed structures to create fortifications. Both loyalists and separatists began adapting to the new reality of Krieg, fabricating protective equipment to allow operations in the contaminated environment and securing access to whatever resources remained in the devastated hives. The Civil War did not end with the nuclear genocide, but rather transformed into a new phase of conflict. The separatist forces that survived still outnumbered the loyalists and remained committed to destroying Jurton's command in revenge for the atomic strikes. The loyalists maintained their position that they had acted correctly in denying Krieg to traitors, and they prepared to continue fighting in the irradiated wasteland the planet had become. The ruins of the hive cities became the battleground for a siege warfare that would persist for 5 centuries, as both sides fought for control of a dead world that neither could truly claim as victory. The nuclear genocide that consumed Krieg in 433 of the 40th millennium marked not the conclusion of the Civil War, but rather its transformation into a conflict of unprecedented duration and brutality. The survivors of both factions found themselves locked in a struggle that would persist for 500 years, fought across a planetary surface transformed into a toxic wasteland where every breath required filtration equipment and every exposed surface bore lethal levels of radiation. The hive cities that had once housed billions became vast graveyards of twisted metal and shattered rockcrete, their ruins serving as fortifications for armies that fought yard by yard through corridors choked with the dead and across plazas where nothing grew except crystallized fallout. The immediate aftermath of the atomic strikes forced both loyalist and separatist forces to adapt their operations to an environment that actively worked to kill anyone exposed to it. The toxic atmosphere required sealed suits or rebreather equipment for any surface operations, while the radiation levels necessitated regular rotation of troops to prevent lethal exposure. The collapse of the hive cities had destroyed most of the infrastructure that supported military operations, eliminating supply depots, vehicle maintenance facilities, and medical stations. Both sides retreated into the deepest levels of the underhives, where the rock and metal overhead provided some shielding from radiation, and where remnants of the old infrastructure could be salvaged to support continued military operations. The separatist forces initially maintained their numerical superiority despite the catastrophic losses inflicted by the nuclear bombardment. The traitor armies that survived the atomic strikes numbered approximately 8 million troops, concentrated in the underhives and outlying installations that had escaped direct hits. These forces retained functional command structures and substantial equipment reserves, including armor and artillery that had been stored in hardened facilities or deployed in the field away from the primary target zones. The separatist leadership, composed of those autocrats who had survived the destruction of the capital and major hives, remained committed to destroying the loyalist forces and executing Colonel Jerton for his decision to unleash the atomic weapons. The loyalist forces counted roughly 2 million effectives in the months following the nuclear exchange, their numbers reduced by the separatist counterstrikes and the environmental devastation that claimed soldiers through radiation exposure and the collapse of their own hive strongholds. Jerton's command occupied defensive positions in the southern polar regions, where the concentration of military installations provided access to weapons stockpiles and manufacturing equipment that had survived the bombardment. The colonel understood that his forces could not defeat the separatists through conventional offensive operations, but he calculated that the transformed environment of Krieg offered opportunities for defensive warfare that could allow the loyalists to survive long enough for Imperial reinforcements to arrive. The strategic situation following the nuclear strikes centered on control of the remaining functional infrastructure scattered across Krieg's devastated surface. Both factions required access to water purification facilities capable of removing radioactive contamination, atmospheric processors that could generate breathable air, and the deep geothermal power plants that continued operating beneath the planet's crust. The manufactorums that survived in the underhives became critical objectives, as both sides needed to produce ammunition, repair equipment, and fabricate the specialized gear required for operations in the toxic environment. The war evolved into a series of grinding campaigns focused on capturing and holding these vital installations, with battles measured not in days, but in years as forces fought through kilometers of tunnel networks and ruined hive sections. The trench warfare that came to define the Krieg Civil War emerged from the practical realities of fighting across an irradiated wasteland. Surface operations required extensive preparation, with engineers excavating trenches deep enough to provide protection from both enemy fire and radiation exposure. These trench systems extended for kilometers across the wastes between hive ruins, connecting strongpoints established in collapsed structures and fortified underhive entrances. The trenches themselves became elaborate defensive networks, with multiple parallel lines connected by communication trenches, reinforced bunkers positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, and elaborate systems of wire obstacles and minefields protecting the approaches. The nature of combat in these trench systems forced both sides to develop specialized tactics and equipment. Infantry assaults across no man's land required troops to advance while wearing full protective gear that restricted vision and mobility, making them vulnerable to defensive fire from entrenched positions. The attackers employed massed artillery bombardments to suppress defensive positions before launching their assaults, but the rubble-strewn terrain and the need to maintain sealed suits made rapid advances nearly impossible. Combat engineers became essential for any offensive operations, using explosives to breach wire obstacles and clear paths through minefields while under fire from defenders who could remain in protected positions. The casualty rates in these trench assaults exceeded anything recorded in conventional Imperial Guard operations. Attacking forces routinely suffered losses of 50% or higher in failed assaults, with entire battalions disappearing into the toxic wastes as they attempted to cross killing grounds swept by defensive fire. The defenders faced their own attrition from the constant artillery bombardments and the raiding parties that infiltrated trench systems during the perpetual twilight created by Krieg's dust-choked atmosphere. Both sides accepted these losses as unavoidable, understanding that the strategic objectives justified whatever casualties were required to achieve them. The evolution of Krieg military doctrine during this period reflected the unique characteristics of the conflict. The loyalist forces, fighting from defensive positions with inferior numbers, developed tactics emphasizing prepared fortifications, interlocking fields of fire, and counterattacks designed to reclaim lost positions rather than seize new territory. Jurton's officers studied the battles of the Horus heresy and the siege warfare of ancient Terra, adapting historical tactics to Krieg-specific conditions. The Loyalists became experts at constructing layered defenses that forced attackers to fight through multiple fortified lines, each position supporting the others, and designed to channel enemy forces into predetermined killing zones. The Separatist forces initially employed more conventional assault tactics, using their numerical superiority to overwhelm Loyalist positions through massed attacks supported by armor and artillery. These operations achieved some successes in the early decades of the siege, capturing outlying Loyalist strongpoints and pushing the defensive perimeter back toward the southern polar regions. However, the casualty rates proved unsustainable even for the larger Separatist armies, and their commanders began adopting more methodical approaches that emphasized artillery preparation and systematic reduction of defensive positions. The traitor forces developed their own siege warfare expertise, learning to identify weak points in Loyalist defenses and concentrate overwhelming force against specific objectives rather than launching broad front offensives. The acceptance of massive casualties as necessary sacrifice became fundamental to the military culture that emerged on both sides during the long siege. The early years of the conflict saw commanders attempting to minimize losses and preserve their forces for future operations, but the strategic reality of Krieg made such conservation impossible. Every objective required assault across open ground against prepared defenses. Every defensive position eventually faced overwhelming attack that forced retreat or resulted in complete annihilation of the garrison. The commanders who survived and rose through the ranks were those who understood that accomplishing the mission mattered more than preserving the troops assigned to it, and who could order soldiers forward into certain death without hesitation or remorse. This mentality permeated down through the ranks as the decades of fighting continued. Soldiers on both sides witnessed entire companies wiped out in single engagements, saw their comrades die from radiation sickness and toxic exposure, and understood that their own survival depended more on chance than skill or courage. The troops developed a fatalistic worldview that accepted death as inevitable and focused instead on ensuring their sacrifice served some tactical purpose. The Loyalist forces in particular embraced this philosophy, viewing their struggle as penance for Krieg's rebellion and their deaths as atonement for the sin of allowing traitors to seize control of the planet. The role of the Vidi Womb technology in sustaining the war effort cannot be understated. Krieg possessed this technology before the Civil War, using it to supplement natural reproduction in maintaining the massive workforce required for the planet's industrial operations. The accelerated gestation programs allowed for the creation of fully developed humans in a fraction of the normal gestation period, with the subjects receiving basic genetic conditioning and chemical treatments that prepared them for their assigned roles. The pre-war applications had been limited by both ethical considerations and the Adeptus Mechanicus oversight that governed such technologies, but the desperate circumstances of the Civil War eliminated these restrictions. The Loyalist forces expanded their use of the Vidi wombs dramatically as the siege progressed and casualties mounted beyond what natural reproduction could replace. The facilities in the southern hives operated continuously, producing cohorts of soldiers who received accelerated physical development and basic combat conditioning before being deployed to the front lines. These vat-grown troops lacked the experience of naturally born soldiers, but they possessed the physical capabilities required for military service and could be produced in numbers that allowed the Loyalists to replace their losses and maintain defensive strength despite the grinding attrition of the trench warfare. The separatist forces implemented their own expanded Vidi Womb programs, though their larger initial population base meant they relied on the technology less heavily in the early decades of the siege. As the war continued and the separatist casualty figures climbed into the tens of millions, the traitor commanders increased production from their own facilities to maintain their numerical advantage. Both sides began viewing soldiers as manufactured resources similar to ammunition or equipment, calculating force strength in terms of production capacity rather than population demographics. The societal implications of this shift fundamentally altered Krieg civilization. The traditional family structures that had existed before the war dissolved as natural reproduction became secondary to vat-grown population replacement. Children born naturally received the same conditioning and training as their vat-grown counterparts, with no distinction made between the two groups once they reached military age. The concept of individual identity diminished in importance as soldiers were designated by numerical codes rather than names, their service records tracked by production batch and deployment date rather than genealogy or family connection. The Vidi Womb technology also enabled modifications to the gestation process that enhanced the resulting soldiers' suitability for Krieg's toxic environment. The Adeptus Mechanicus genetors, who oversaw the facilities on both sides, implemented genetic adjustments that increased radiation resistance, enhanced the subject's ability to process contaminated air and water, and modified their psychological conditioning to emphasize obedience and disregard for personal survival. These modifications accumulated over generations of vat-grown soldiers, creating a population increasingly adapted to Krieg's wasteland conditions, but progressively more divorced from baseline human norms. The Death Korps mentality that would later become synonymous with Krieg originated in these centuries of siege warfare. The combination of constant exposure to death, the acceptance of massive casualties as tactically necessary, and the psychological conditioning implemented through the Vidi Womb programs produced soldiers who viewed their own lives as expendable resources to be spent in service to their cause. The Loyalist forces embraced this philosophy most completely, framing their struggle in terms of atonement for Krieg's rebellion and viewing their deaths as necessary sacrifice to redeem their world in the Emperor's eyes. The religious dimension of this mentality intensified as the war progressed. The ecclesiarchy priests who survived the nuclear genocide preached that Krieg's devastation represented divine punishment for the planet's sin in allowing rebellion against the Emperor's authority. They taught that only through complete sacrifice could the Krieger people earn forgiveness, and that every soldier who died fighting the traitors contributed to the planet's redemption. This theology resonated with troops who needed some framework to comprehend the horror of their existence, providing purpose to suffering that otherwise seemed meaningless. The Death Korps soldiers began viewing themselves as penitents rather than conventional warriors, their service a form of religious devotion expressed through absolute obedience and willingness to die without question. The final decades of the 500-year siege saw the gradual collapse of separatist resistance despite their continued numerical superiority. The loyalist forces had consolidated their defensive positions into an interconnected network of fortifications that proved impossible to reduce through conventional assault. The separatists launched massive offensives that gained temporary penetrations into loyalist territory, but these advances invariably stalled against secondary defensive lines and were eliminated by counterattacks that reclaimed the lost ground at terrible cost. The traitor forces found themselves locked in a war of attrition they could not win, their casualties mounting faster than even their Vidi-Womb facilities could replace them. The separatist command structure fragmented as the surviving autocrats turned on each other, blaming one another for the failure to defeat the loyalists and competing for control of dwindling resources. Some traitor commanders attempted to negotiate with the loyalists, offering to surrender in exchange for clemency, but Jurten refused all such overtures. The colonel maintained that the only acceptable outcome was complete separatist defeat and the restoration of imperial authority over all of Krieg. The loyalist forces pressed their advantage as separatist cohesion deteriorated, launching limited offensives that reclaimed territory and captured critical installations. The final separatist strongholds fell in 940 of the 40th millennium, 507 years after Colonel Jurten had ordered the nuclear strikes that devastated the planet. The last traitor forces surrendered after their command structure collapsed completely and their supply situation became untenable. The loyalist victory came at a cost that defied comprehension, with casualty estimates suggesting that over 60 billion Kriegers had died during the Civil War and the subsequent siege. The planet's surface remained a toxic wasteland, where survival required constant protection from radiation and chemical contamination. The great hive cities existed only as ruins haunted by the ghosts of their former populations. The re-establishment of contact with the Imperium occurred within months of the final separatist defeat. Loyalist forces managed to seize control of the orbital defense platforms, eliminating the blockade that had isolated Krieg for 5 centuries. The signals sent into the void reached Imperial monitoring stations in neighboring systems, bringing the first news of Krieg's situation to authorities who had long since written off the planet as lost. The Administratum dispatched inspection teams to assess the situation and determine whether Krieg retained any value to the Imperium. The inspection teams found a world transformed beyond recognition from the productive hive planet recorded in Imperial archives. The Administratum officials documented the environmental devastation, the collapsed hive cities, and the massive casualties suffered during the prolonged civil war. They also observed the military forces that had survived the conflict, noting their discipline, their specialized equipment for operations in toxic environments, and their apparent disregard for casualties or hardship. The Death Korps soldiers demonstrated their capabilities in exercises conducted for the inspection teams, executing complex assault operations against fortified positions with precision and absolute obedience to orders. Colonel Jurten, now ancient beyond his years from the stress of commanding the 5-century siege, formally offered Krieg's military forces to the Imperium as penance for the rebellion that had nearly torn the planet from the Emperor's domain. He presented the Death Korps regiments as instruments of atonement, soldiers whose lives existed solely to serve the Imperium and who would accept any mission regardless of the expected casualties. The Administratum representatives recognized the potential value of such forces, particularly given the Imperium's constant need for troops willing to undertake the most hazardous operations. Krieg received authorization to raise regiments for Imperial Guard service, transforming the Death Korps from planetary defense forces into a resource that would serve on battlefields across the galaxy. The Krieg that emerged from 5 centuries of siege warfare bore no resemblance to the Hive World that had existed before the Civil War. The planet's surface remained a wasteland where temperatures fluctuated between extremes that would kill unprotected humans within minutes, where the atmosphere carried enough toxins to dissolve lung tissue, and where radiation levels in certain zones exceeded what even the most hardened equipment could withstand for extended periods. The great hive cities existed as skeletal ruins. Their towering spires collapsed into mountains of rubble that stretched across the landscape like the bones of dead gods. The population that survived occupied the deep underhive warrens, living in tunnels and chambers carved into bedrock hundreds of meters below the poisoned surface, their existence sustained by geothermal power plants and hydroponic facilities that produced barely adequate nutrition. The societal structure that developed in these underground warrens reflected the necessities of survival in an environment that offered no margin for inefficiency or individual deviation from collective purpose. The civilian population of Krieg numbered perhaps 200 million souls scattered across the various underhive complexes, a catastrophic reduction from the tens of billions who had inhabited the planet before the rebellion. These civilians existed solely to support military production and the raising of new regiments for Imperial Guard service. Every aspect of their lives served this singular function, from the work assignments that determined their daily activities to the genetic material they contributed to the Vidi womb facilities that produced the majority of Krieg's population. The typical Krieger civilian spent 14 hours each day in the manufactorums and workshops that occupied vast sections of the underhive warrens. These facilities produced the specialized equipment required by the Death Korps regiments, from the distinctive greatcoats and rebreather masks that protected against toxic atmospheres to the shovels and entrenching tools that enabled the rapid construction of trench systems. The workers assembled lasguns according to patterns that had been refined over centuries of constant warfare, fabricated the components for Liman rust tanks in foundries heated by geothermal vents, and processed chemicals for use in artillery shells and grenades. The work proceeded in silence, broken only by the sounds of machinery and the occasional barked order from overseers who monitored production quotas with absolute precision. The hab blocks where civilians resided between shifts consisted of narrow chambers carved from rock, each housing 4 to 6 individuals in spaces measuring perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters. The chambers contained bunks welded to the walls, storage lockers for personal effects that amounted to a change of work clothing and basic hygiene supplies, and nothing else. The corridors connecting these chambers to the work areas and communal facilities stretched for kilometers through the underhives, lit by flickering luminators that cast everything in harsh white light. The air in these tunnels carried the metallic taste of recycled atmosphere processed through filters that removed toxins, but left behind trace elements that accumulated in the lungs over years of exposure. Meals for the civilian population came from communal dispensaries that served rations produced in the hydroponic facilities and protein synthesis plants. The food consisted of gray paste with the consistency of wet clay, supplemented by compressed bars that provided necessary calories and nutrients in forms that bore no resemblance to anything that could be identified as having originated from recognizable sources. The Kriegers consumed these rations without complaint, understanding that the limited agricultural capacity of their world permitted no luxuries, and that maintaining adequate nutrition for the population required complete utilization of available resources. Children received slightly enhanced rations to support their growth, while the elderly who could no longer work received reduced portions that reflected their diminished contribution to collective productivity. The concept of family, as understood on other imperial worlds, held no meaning in Krieg society. The Vidi womb facilities produced approximately 80% of the population, with natural births occurring only when civilians engaged in reproduction without official sanction, or when the Munitorum priests determined that genetic diversity required the introduction of naturally conceived individuals into the population. Children emerged from the gestation tanks with basic conditioning already imprinted into their developing brains, their genetic structure modified to enhance radiation resistance and psychological traits deemed desirable for military service. These vat-grown children spent their first years in institutional facilities, where they received education focused entirely on practical skills and indoctrination into Krieg's culture of duty and sacrifice. The naturally born children received identical treatment once they reached the age of 3 standard years, taken from whatever parents had produced them, and placed in the same institutional facilities as their vat-grown counterparts. The transition occurred without ceremony or acknowledgement of any bond between parent and child. The adults who had conceived these children understood that their offspring belonged to Krieg and the Imperium rather than to them, and they accepted the separation as they accepted every other aspect of their regimented existence. The children themselves received conditioning that suppressed emotional attachment and emphasized their identity as components of the collective rather than as individuals with personal relationships or aspirations. Education on Krieg focused exclusively on preparing children for their future roles in either military service or civilian support functions. The curriculum included basic literacy sufficient to read technical manuals and military orders, mathematical skills necessary for calculating ranges and managing logistics, and extensive physical conditioning that built endurance and strength. The students learned the proper maintenance procedures for lasguns before they reached the age of 10, practiced assembling and disassembling equipment while wearing the restrictive gloves of environmental suits, and studied the tactical principles of trench warfare through endless repetition of approved doctrine. History lessons covered only Krieg's rebellion and the 500-year siege, emphasizing the shame of the planet's treason and the debt owed to the Emperor for allowing Krieg to redeem itself through military service. The Munitorum priests who oversaw Krieg's spiritual life represented a fusion of the ecclesiarchy's theology with the specific circumstances of the Death World. These priests preached that Krieg existed in a state of perpetual penance, its people condemned to suffer for the sin of rebellion until such time as the Emperor judged their atonement sufficient. They taught that every creature carried the stain of the traitor autocrat's treason, a spiritual contamination that could only be cleansed through absolute sacrifice in service to the Imperium. The sermons delivered in the chapel factories scattered throughout the underhives emphasized that death in battle represented the highest achievement possible for a creature, the moment when individual existence ended in service to the Emperor, and the debt of rebellion was reduced by one more payment. The imperial cult as practiced on Krieg diverged significantly from the versions found on other worlds. The priests made no promises of the Emperor's love or protection, offered no comfort to the suffering, and preached no message of hope for better circumstances. Instead, they presented the Emperor as a stern judge who observed Krieg's efforts at redemption with cold calculation, measuring the planet's sacrifices against the magnitude of its crime. The God Emperor of Krieg existed as a figure of absolute authority whose expectations could never be fully satisfied, whose judgment remained forever suspended over the planet like the radioactive ash that choked its skies. The daily services conducted in the chapel factories lasted precisely 15 minutes, time to fit between work shifts without reducing productive hours. The congregation stood in formation, while the priests delivered sermons that rarely varied in content or tone, reciting the litanies of duty and sacrifice that every creature had memorized before reaching adulthood. The services concluded with the congregation chanting their oath of service, promising to give their lives without hesitation when called upon and accepting death as the wages of their ancestors' sin. The words carried no particular emotion or fervor, spoken in the same flat tones the creatures used for all verbal communication, a recitation of facts rather than an expression of faith. The relationship between the creature people and death transcended the fatalism common among Imperial Guard regiments that faced hazardous deployments. The Death Korps soldiers did not simply accept the possibility of death as an occupational hazard of military service, but rather viewed their deaths as inevitable and desirable outcomes. The psychological conditioning implemented through the Vidi Womb programs and reinforced through constant indoctrination created individuals who possessed no survival instinct in the conventional sense, who calculated tactical decisions based purely on mission objectives without consideration for personal preservation. A Death Korps soldier ordered to advance across open ground against prepared defenses would do so without hesitation, fear, or hope of survival, understanding that his death served the Emperor and reduced Krieg's debt of shame. This mentality manifested in behaviors that other Imperial Guard regiments found disturbing. Death Korps soldiers never sought medical treatment for wounds that did not prevent them from performing their duties, considering such requests an inappropriate diversion of resources. They volunteered for suicide missions without any expectation of recognition or reward, viewing such assignments as opportunities to fulfill their purpose rather than as punishments or desperate measures. When Death Korps units suffered casualties, the survivors showed no grief or distress, simply closing ranks and continuing their assigned tasks with the same mechanical efficiency they had displayed before their comrades fell. The training regimen that prepared Kriegers for military service reflected this philosophy of expendable sacrifice. The candidates who reached military age at 16 standard years entered training facilities, where they spent 2 years learning the specific skills required for their assigned specializations. Infantry received instruction in trench warfare tactics, practicing assault techniques in mock-up trench systems, where they advanced under live fire from instructors who deliberately targeted a percentage of trainees to simulate combat casualties. The candidates who died during these exercises received no particular acknowledgement beyond the removal of their bodies and the notation of their deaths in training records. Those who survived understood that their fallen comrades had simply proven inadequate for military service, their deaths serving the purpose of identifying weakness before it could compromise actual combat operations. The specialized troops who operated Krieg's armored vehicles and artillery pieces underwent extended training that emphasized technical proficiency and the ability to continue operations despite casualties among crew members. A Liman Rust tank crew trained to function with any combination of surviving members, each soldier capable of performing multiple roles, so that the vehicle could continue fighting even after suffering losses that would disable crews from other regiments. Artillery teams practiced maintaining fire rates while under counter-battery bombardment, the trainees learning to serve their guns while their comrades died around them, and to calculate firing solutions, while breathing through rebreathers filled with simulated chemical agents. The Death Korps regiments raised for Imperial Guard service-departed Krieg, with equipment that reflected the planet's industrial capacity and its specific expertise in siege warfare. Each regiment received standard pattern lasguns, modified with reinforced seals to function in toxic atmospheres, greatcoats manufactured from materials that provided some protection against chemical weapons, and the distinctive rebreather masks that allowed extended operations in contaminated environments. The regiments deployed with extensive engineering equipment, including portable trench digging tools, wire obstacles, and demolition charges, along with quantities of chemical and biological weapons that other Imperial Guard forces rarely employed due to ethical restrictions that held no weight on Krieg. The officers who commanded these regiments rose through the ranks based purely on demonstrated competence in leading troops and achieving tactical objectives. Krieg possessed no aristocratic class from which to draw its officer corps, the old autocracy having been eliminated during the Civil War. Instead, candidates for command positions emerged from the enlisted ranks, identified by overseers who noted their ability to make tactical decisions and coordinate unit actions. These individuals received additional training in military theory and logistics, but remained fundamentally similar to the soldiers they commanded, sharing the same conditioning and the same view of their lives as expendable resources. The commissars assigned to Death Korps regiments by the Officio Prefectus discovered that their traditional role of maintaining morale and preventing cowardice had no application among Krieg troops. The Death Korps required no threats or inspirational speeches to motivate them to advance into enemy fire, no summary executions to prevent retreat, and no monitoring for signs of defeatism or doubt. Instead, the commissars found themselves restraining the Kriegers from suicidal actions that would waste lives without achieving tactical benefit, a complete inversion of their normal duties. Some commissars adapted to this reality and became effective commanders who understood how to employ Death Korps troops efficiently. Others found the experience deeply unsettling and requested transfers to more conventional regiments, where soldiers displayed recognizably human responses to danger and death. The population of Krieg understood that military service represented the inevitable destiny of the vast majority of citizens. The few who remained in civilian roles did so because they possessed specialized skills required for maintaining the Underhive infrastructure or operating the Vidi Womb facilities, not because they had chosen such positions or avoided military service. These civilians regarded the soldiers departing for Imperial Guard service with neither envy nor pity, recognizing that different assignments served the same ultimate purpose of redeeming Krieg through service to the Imperium. The departing regiments received no ceremonies or celebrations, boarding their transport ships in the same silence that characterized all Krieg activities, their absence noted only in production schedules that adjusted workforce allocations to account for the reduced population. The Death World classification that Krieg received from the Administratum reflected both its hostile environment and the nature of its people. The planet produced soldiers whose capabilities in siege warfare and toxic environment operations exceeded those of virtually any other Imperial Guard regiments, but the cost of creating such soldiers involved the complete subordination of human individuality to collective purpose. The Kriegers existed as components of a military machine, their lives measured in terms of tactical utility rather than human value, their society organized around the single function of producing soldiers to die in the Emperor's service. The radioactive wastelands of their homeworld served as both punishment for ancient rebellion and forge for the weapons that would help defend the Imperium across countless battlefields, each Death Korps soldier carrying within them the determination to purchase redemption through sacrifice measured in blood and lives spent without hesitation or regret. The organizational structure of the Death Korps regiments diverges from standard Imperial Guard templates in ways that reflect both Krieg's unique military culture and the specialized nature of siege warfare operations. The Adeptus Militarum initially attempted to impose conventional organizational patterns on the first Death Korps regiments raised after contact with the Imperium was reestablished, but these efforts foundered against the practical realities of how Krieg formations functioned most effectively. The Militarum eventually accepted a modified organizational structure that incorporated elements of standard Imperial Guard doctrine while accommodating the Death Korps' distinctive operational requirements and tactical specializations. The basic infantry regiment of the Death Korps consists of approximately 3,000 soldiers organized into 10 companies of 300 troops each. This represents a smaller total strength than many standard Imperial Guard infantry regiments, which typically field between 4,000 and 5,000 soldiers, but the Death Korps compensates for reduced numbers through enhanced combat effectiveness and the inclusion of specialized support elements within the regimental structure. Each company subdivides into 3 platoons of 100 soldiers, with platoons further divided into 10 squads of 10 men. This decimal organization simplifies command and control in the confused circumstances of trench warfare, where communications often fail and units must operate independently while maintaining tactical cohesion. The squad represents the fundamental tactical unit of Death Korps infantry operations. The 10 soldiers include a watchmaster who serves as squad leader, 8 line troopers carrying standard lasguns, and 1 specialist equipped with either a flamer, melt-a-gun, or plasma gun, depending on the squad's assigned role. The watchmaster carries the same equipment as the line troopers, but bears responsibility for tactical decision-making at the squad level, directing his soldiers to execute specific tasks within the broader framework of platoon operations. The Death Korps eschews the use of Vox equipment at squad level, relying instead on hand signals and whistle codes to communicate orders in environments where electronic communications fail due to interference from chemical weapons or damaged infrastructure. The platoon command element consists of the platoon watchmaster, a Vox operator who maintains communications with company headquarters, and a Medicae orderly whose function differs significantly from medics in conventional Imperial Guard units. The Death Korps Medicae orderlies focus primarily on keeping wounded soldiers functional enough to continue fighting rather than providing comprehensive medical care. They carry combat stimulants, coagulants to stop bleeding from wounds that would otherwise incapacitate, and the tools necessary to perform field amputations or other emergency procedures that allow injured soldiers to return to combat. The concept of evacuating wounded for treatment exists in Death Korps doctrine only for injuries severe enough to prevent any further combat contribution, and even then, the wounded often refuse evacuation unless ordered to accept it by their commanding officers. Company headquarters includes the company watchmaster, a second-in-command who assumes control if the watchmaster becomes a casualty, a Vox section maintaining communications across the company and with regimental command, and a small cadre of specialists including engineers and chemical weapons handlers. The company watchmaster exercises tactical command over his 3 platoons, coordinating their actions to achieve objectives assigned by the regimental staff. Death Korps company watchmasters typically possess 5 to 10 years of combat experience, having survived long enough to demonstrate the tactical competence and leadership capability required for company-level command. Their authority derives entirely from proven performance rather than social status or formal military education, as Krieg produces no officer academies or institutions that grant commissions based on criteria other than combat effectiveness. The regimental headquarters represents a more elaborate command structure that coordinates the actions of the 10 companies and manages the various support elements attached to the regiment. The regimental colonel commands the formation, supported by a staff that includes operations officers responsible for tactical planning, logistics officers managing supply and equipment, and intelligence officers analyzing enemy dispositions and terrain. The Death Korps regimental staff operates with greater autonomy than their counterparts in many Imperial Guard regiments, as the Munitorum recognizes that Krieg officers possess specialized expertise in siege warfare that exceeds the knowledge base of most Adeptus Munitorum officials. This autonomy extends to tactical decision-making, but not to strategic deployment, as the Death Korps regiments remain subject to orders from higher Imperial Guard command structures regarding where and when they conduct operations. The siege regiments of the Death Korps maintain organizational structures similar to standard infantry regiments, but include enhanced engineering capabilities and specialized equipment for reducing fortified positions. A typical siege regiment fields approximately 2,500 infantry organized into 8 companies, with the reduced infantry strength offset by the attachment of 4 companies of combat engineers numbering 200 soldiers each. These engineer companies operate heavy equipment including mole mortars, Hades breaching drills, and demolition charges sufficient to breach fortress walls or collapse bunker complexes. The engineers receive extensive training in explosives handling, structural assessment to identify weak points in fortifications, and the construction of siege works including saps, mining tunnels, and artillery positions. The combat engineers of the Death Korps distinguish themselves from standard Imperial Guard pioneers through their specialization in offensive siege operations rather than defensive fortification construction. While Death Korps engineers certainly possess the capability to build trench systems and defensive positions, their primary function involves creating the conditions necessary for infantry assault forces to close with fortified enemy positions. The engineers advance ahead of the main infantry formations, often working under direct enemy fire as they clear obstacles, breach walls, and neutralize defensive positions. The casualty rates among Death Korps engineer companies exceed even the already horrific losses suffered by standard infantry, as the engineers must expose themselves to enemy fire while performing tasks that require precision and cannot be rushed without risking mission failure. The armored regiments raised by Krieg deploy approximately 70 Leman Russ battle tanks organized into 7 squadrons of 10 vehicles each. This represents a smaller armored force than some Imperial Guard armored regiments field, but Death Korps tank units compensate through their willingness to accept casualties that would cause other formations to withdraw and regroup. The tanks themselves follow standard Lehman-Russ patterns produced across the Imperium, though Krieg's manufactorums incorporate modifications, including enhanced air filtration systems, reinforced hatches that seal against chemical weapons, and additional external storage for the engineering equipment that Death Korps armor crews carry to support infantry operations. The most common variant deployed by Death Korps armored regiments is the standard battle cannon configuration, valued for its versatility in engaging both enemy armor and fortified positions. Each tank squadron operates as a semi-independent tactical unit capable of conducting operations without constant direction from regimental command. The squadron commander, typically a veteran tank commander who has survived multiple campaigns, coordinates the actions of his 10 tanks to achieve assigned objectives while adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Death Korps armor doctrine emphasizes aggressive forward movement and close-range engagement, accepting losses to friendly fire and enemy anti-armor weapons as necessary costs of maintaining offensive momentum. The tank crews train extensively in damage control procedures that allow them to continue fighting even after suffering hits that would disable less determined crews, with individual crew members capable of performing multiple roles to keep their vehicles operational despite casualties. The Death Rider cavalry squadrons represent one of the most distinctive elements of Death Korps' military organization. These mounted troops ride specially bred horses descended from stock that survived Krieg's nuclear devastation, animals that possess enhanced radiation resistance, and the ability to consume the limited forage available on the Death World. A Death Rider squadron consists of 120 riders organized into 4 troops of 30 cavalrymen each, with each troop subdividing into 3 sections of 10 riders. The Death Riders serve as reconnaissance forces, rapid reaction units, and shock cavalry capable of exploiting breakthroughs in enemy lines or conducting deep raids against supply depots and command facilities. The horses ridden by Death Rider squadrons stand approximately 15 hands high, smaller than many cavalry mounts, but possessing exceptional endurance and the ability to function in toxic atmospheres when fitted with specialized breathing apparatus. The animals receive the same rebreather equipment as their riders, with masks designed to fit equine anatomy and filter systems that protect against chemical weapons and radioactive particulates. The Death Riders themselves carry lances for shock combat, bolt pistols or las pistols for ranged engagement, and explosive charges for demolition tasks. They wear modified versions of the standard Death Korps greatcoat designed to accommodate mounted operations, with reinforced sections protecting their legs from enemy fire and the friction of extended riding. The commissariat's relationship with Death Korps regiments inverts the traditional dynamic between commissars and Imperial Guard troops. The Officio Praefectus discovered early in its oversight of Krieg formations that the standard commissarial functions of maintaining discipline and preventing cowardice had no application among soldiers who possessed no capacity for fear and whose conditioning eliminated any possibility of insubordination or retreat without orders. Instead, commissars assigned to Death Korps regiments find themselves restraining troops from wasteful sacrifices that achieve no tactical purpose, preventing soldiers from volunteering for suicide missions when alternative approaches might accomplish objectives with lower casualties, and occasionally ordering withdrawals that Death Korps officers would never initiate on their own authority. The commissars who serve effectively with Death Korps regiments undergo specialized training before their assignments. The Schola Progenium facilities that produce commissars maintain specific programs for those destined to serve with Krieg formations, educating them in the unique characteristics of Death Korps military culture and the particular challenges of commanding troops who view their own deaths as desirable outcomes. These commissars learn to recognize the difference between tactically sound aggressive operations and pointless sacrifices, to identify when Death Korps soldiers are pursuing objectives that cannot be achieved regardless of casualties accepted, and to intervene in ways that redirect Krieg's suicidal determination toward productive military results. The authority structure within Death Korps regiments places commissars in positions of genuine command, rather than the supervisory role they occupy in many Imperial Guard formations. A commissar attached to a Death Korps regiment often functions as the regimental second in command, working closely with the colonel to develop tactical plans and issuing orders directly to company watchmasters when circumstances require immediate intervention. The Death Korps soldiers accept commissarial authority without question, viewing commissars as representatives of imperial authority whose orders carry the weight of the emperor's will. This acceptance extends even to orders that contradict the soldiers' conditioning toward self-sacrifice, as the Kriegers understand that their purpose involves serving the Imperium's interests rather than simply dying in the most dramatic fashion possible. The Watchmaster rank within Death Korps regiments represents a formalization of the leadership positions that emerged during the 500-year siege. The title derives from the siege warfare practice of maintaining constant observation of enemy positions, with watchmasters originally serving as the soldiers responsible for monitoring specific sectors of the front lines and alerting their units to enemy activity. The role evolved to encompass broader leadership responsibilities as the siege progressed, with effective watchmasters demonstrating the ability to make tactical decisions and coordinate their soldiers' actions. The modern Death Korps maintains this rank structure, using Watchmaster as the designation for all leadership positions from squad level through company command. The selection process for Watchmasters emphasizes demonstrated competence in combat rather than formal qualifications or testing. Soldiers who consistently make sound tactical decisions, who maintain effectiveness under the extreme stress of siege warfare, and who survive long enough to accumulate significant combat experience receive consideration for promotion to Watchmaster positions. The selection occurs through recommendations from current Watchmasters and approval by regimental command staff, with no input from the promoted soldier himself. A Krieger informed of his promotion to Watchmaster accepts the new responsibilities without pride or satisfaction, understanding that the assignment reflects the regiment's needs rather than any personal achievement worthy of recognition. The Quartermaster Corps within Death Korps regiments manages logistics with the same mechanical efficiency that characterizes all aspects of Krieg military operations. The Quartermasters maintain detailed inventories of ammunition, equipment, rations, and medical supplies, calculating consumption rates and coordinating resupply operations to ensure the regiment maintains combat effectiveness. Death Korps logistics differ from standard Imperial Guard supply procedures through their emphasis on ammunition and engineering materials rather than soldier comfort or morale maintenance. A Death Korps regiment carries minimal medical supplies beyond basic trauma treatment equipment, no recreational materials, and rations calculated to provide adequate nutrition without any consideration for palatability or variety. The Engineers Corps attached to Death Korps formations operates as a semi-autonomous organization within the regimental structure. The Senior Engineer Watchmaster coordinates directly with the regimental colonel to plan siege operations, assess enemy fortifications, and allocate engineering resources across the regiment's operational area. The Engineers Corps maintains its own supply chain for specialized equipment, including explosives, breaching charges, and the components necessary for constructing siege works. Engineer units often operate independently of the main infantry formations, advancing ahead to prepare assault routes or remaining behind to fortify captured positions while the infantry continues its advance. The logistics requirements for deploying Death Korps regiments exceed those of many standard Imperial Guard formations due to the specialized equipment and ammunition consumption rates characteristic of siege warfare operations. A single Death Korps infantry regiment conducting active siege operations consumes approximately 500 tons of ammunition daily, including artillery shells, lasgun power packs, and demolition charges. The regiments require constant resupply of rebreather filters, environmental suit components, and chemical weapon stocks. The Munitorum officials responsible for supporting Death Korps deployments must maintain supply chains capable of delivering these materials to forward positions, often under enemy fire, and in environments where conventional logistics procedures fail due to contamination or infrastructure damage. The integration of Death Korps regiments into larger Imperial Guard formations presents challenges for commanders accustomed to more conventional troops. The Death Korps' tendency to accept massive casualties in pursuit of objectives conflicts with the operational approaches of many Imperial Guard forces, which attempt to minimize losses while achieving their missions. Commanders who successfully employ Death Korps regiments learn to assign them objectives, where their unique capabilities provide maximum advantage, typically involving the reduction of heavily fortified positions or operations in toxic environments where other troops cannot function effectively. The Death Korps excels in situations where success requires soldiers willing to die in large numbers to achieve breakthrough, where conventional tactics would stall against prepared defenses, and where the psychological impact of facing troops who demonstrate no fear or hesitation breaks enemy morale. The standard equipment issued to Death Korps infantry reflects centuries of refinement through continuous siege warfare in environments that would kill unprotected humans within minutes. Every piece of gear serves a specific function related to survival in toxic atmospheres or the prosecution of trench warfare, with no consideration given to comfort or appearance beyond what tactical necessity demands. The Death Korps soldier deploys into combat carrying approximately 40 kilograms of equipment distributed across his body and webbing, a load that would exhaust troops from less physically conditioned regiments, but which Kriegers bear without complaint through extended operations. The Mark IX pattern flak armor forms the foundation of Death Korps protective equipment. This armor consists of multiple layers of reinforced fabric and ablative plates covering the torso, with additional protection for the shoulders and upper arms. The Mark IX differs from standard Imperial Guard flak armor through its integrated sealing system, which connects directly to the rebreather apparatus and creates an enclosed environment protecting the wearer from chemical weapons and radioactive contamination. The armor plates themselves incorporate laid-line sections that provide limited shielding against radiation exposure, though prolonged operations in high radiation zones still result in lethal doses accumulating over time. The gray color of Death Korps armor comes from the specific composite materials used in its construction rather than from any aesthetic choice, the manufacturers on Krieg having determined that these materials offer optimal protection against the specific threats their soldiers face most frequently. The rebreather system represents perhaps the most critical component of Death Korps equipment. The mask covers the entire face, with reinforced glass lenses protecting the eyes and a complex filtration apparatus processing incoming air to remove toxins, chemical agents, and radioactive particles. The filters connect to canisters mounted on the soldier's chest webbing, with each canister providing approximately 8 hours of protection in heavily contaminated environments before requiring replacement. Death Korps soldiers carry a minimum of 4 replacement canisters on combat operations, though extended deployments require regular resupply of filters to maintain operational capability. The rebreather connects to the sealed flak armor through locking collars that prevent any contaminated air from entering the protected environment, with redundant seals ensuring that damage to one connection point does not compromise the entire system. The Mark XIV pattern lasgun issued to Death Korps infantry incorporates modifications specific to operations in hostile environments. The weapon's casing features enhanced sealing around all moving parts, preventing the infiltration of dust, moisture, or chemical agents that could cause malfunctions. The power pack connection includes additional weatherproofing that allows the weapon to function after immersion in contaminated water or exposure to corrosive atmospheres. The barrel assembly incorporates a slightly longer design than standard lasguns, providing improved accuracy at the extended ranges common in trench warfare, where targets often appear at distances of 300 meters or more across no man's land. The weapon's furniture consists of synthetic materials resistant to the chemical agents Death Korps forces employ, as wooden stocks would deteriorate rapidly when exposed to the toxins that saturate battlefields where Krieg regiments operate. The entrenching tool carried by every Death Korps soldier represents far more than a simple shovel. The implement features a reinforced blade capable of cutting through rockcrete and packed earth, with serrated edges that allow it to function as a close combat weapon when circumstances force soldiers into hand-to-hand fighting in confined trench sections. The handle extends to approximately 1 meter in length, providing leverage for digging operations, while remaining short enough to wield effectively in the cramped confines of bunkers and tunnels. Death Korps soldiers practice extensively with their entrenching tools, learning techniques for rapid excavation that allow them to construct fighting positions within minutes of reaching new terrain. The tools also serve for clearing rubble, breaching thin walls, and the grim task of burying the dead when time permits such activities. The greatcoat worn by Death Korps infantry provides protection against the temperature extremes common on irradiated worlds and in the deep trenches where Krieg forces conduct much of their fighting. The heavy fabric resists tears from barbed wire and provides some defense against shrapnel from artillery bombardments. Chemical treatments applied during manufacturing give the greatcoats limited protection against certain chemical weapons, though the primary defense against such threats remains the sealed armor and rebreather system. The coats extend to mid-calf length, with reinforced sections at the shoulders and elbows where wear occurs most rapidly. The gray color matches the flak armor, creating a uniform appearance that makes individual soldiers difficult to distinguish from one another, a characteristic that suits the Death Korps philosophy of subordinating individual identity to collective purpose. The webbing system worn over the flak armor distributes the weight of ammunition, grenades, and other equipment across the soldier's body. The standard load includes 6 lasgun power packs providing 300 shots total, 4 rebreather filter canisters, 6 fragmentation grenades, 2 crack grenades for use against armored targets, a water canteen containing 1 liter of purified water, and rations sufficient for 72 hours of operations. Additional pouches carry specialized equipment depending on the soldier's role within his squad, with grenadiers carrying extra demolition charges and designated marksmen carrying extended range power packs that provide fewer shots but increased penetration at distance. The specialized siege equipment employed by Death Korps regiments includes weapons and tools rarely seen in other Imperial Guard formations. The Hades breaching drill represents one of the most distinctive pieces of Krieg engineering, a massive vehicle-mounted drill capable of boring through fortress walls or creating tunnels beneath enemy fortifications. The drill consists of a rotating head studded with adamantium teeth, powered by a compact plasma reactor that provides the enormous energy required to cut through reinforced rockcrete and armored plating. The vehicle carrying the drill measures approximately 8 meters in length and 4 meters in width, with treads that provide traction in loose soil and rubble. The crew compartment houses 6 soldiers who operate the drill and provide security during breaching operations, though the noise generated by the drilling process makes surprise impossible and crews typically face concentrated enemy fire once they breach into enemy-held spaces. The operation of a Hades breaching drill requires careful planning and coordination with supporting infantry. The drill advances toward the target fortification under covering fire from artillery and infantry weapons, its armored hull designed to resist small arms fire, and shell fragments though vulnerable to direct hits from anti-tank weapons. Once positioned against the target wall or at the entrance to a planned tunnel, the drill begins its work at a rate of approximately 1 meter per hour through solid rockcrete. The crew monitors structural integrity during the drilling process, watching for signs that the wall might collapse prematurely or that the tunnel might cave in before infantry can advance through it. When the drill breaks through into enemy-held space, the crew immediately withdraws while assault troops rush forward to exploit the breach before defenders can establish new defensive positions. The demolition charges carried by Death Korps combat engineers range from small-shaped charges designed to breach doors and thin walls to massive explosive packages capable of collapsing bunker complexes or destroying bridges. The standard breaching charge consists of approximately 5 kilograms of high explosive configured in a cone shape that focuses the blast force against a specific point, allowing engineers to create man-sized holes in walls up to 1 meter thick. Larger charges employ up to 50 kilograms of explosive for use against more substantial fortifications, with engineers calculating precise placement based on structural analysis of the target. The Death Korps maintains extensive technical documentation on fortification construction techniques, allowing their engineers to identify weak points in enemy defensive works and position charges for maximum effect. The mole mortar represents another specialized weapon in the Death Korps arsenal, designed specifically for siege warfare applications. This weapon fires rocket-propelled shells at high angles, allowing them to drop nearly vertically onto targets protected by overhead cover. The shells themselves carry specialized warheads, including bunker-busting penetrators that punch through reinforced roofs before detonating inside, chemical payloads that flood enclosed spaces with toxins, and incendiary charges that create firestorms in enemy trenches. The mole mortar's range extends to approximately 3 kilometers, sufficient to strike enemy positions from protected firing positions in friendly territory. The weapon's crew consists of 4 soldiers who handle the loading, aiming, and firing procedures, with each crew capable of maintaining a firing rate of approximately 4 shells per minute during sustained bombardment operations. The trench warfare tools employed by Death Korps forces include specialized equipment for constructing and maintaining the elaborate defensive systems that characterize siege operations. Portable wire obstacle sections allow rapid deployment of barriers across no man's land, with each section consisting of coiled razor wire mounted on metal frames that interlock to create continuous obstacles. The engineers carry specialized cutters capable of severing these wires, though the process remains time-consuming and exposes the engineers to defensive fire while they work. Duckboard sections provide stable footing in trenches where mud and water would otherwise make movement impossible, with the wooden planks treated to resist rot and chemical contamination. Sandbags filled with local soil or rubble create reinforced positions and repair damaged sections of trench walls, with each infantry squad carrying sufficient bags to construct a basic fighting position. The armored divisions raised by Krieg deploy vehicles that emphasize durability and maintainability over speed or sophisticated technology. The Leman Russ battle tanks that form the core of Death Korps armored regiments receive modifications in Krieg's manufactorums that enhance their suitability for extended siege campaigns. The engines incorporate additional filtration systems that prevent the ingestion of contaminated air or dust that would damage more sensitive power plants. The fuel tanks expand to provide extended operational range, allowing the tanks to operate for up to 1 week without resupply in situations where logistics chains become disrupted. The crew compartments include enhanced life support systems that maintain breathable atmosphere even when the vehicle operates in toxic environments, with the crews wearing their rebreather equipment as backup in case the vehicle's systems fail. The standard Leman Russ configuration, deployed by Death Korps armored regiments, mounts the battle cannon in the turret, supported by a hull-mounted heavy bolter and a pintle-mounted heavy stubber for anti-infantry defense. This armament provides versatility against both enemy armor and fortified positions, with the battle cannon capable of firing armor-piercing shells against tanks or high-explosive shells against bunkers and trench systems. The Death Korps also employs substantial numbers of demolisher variants, which replace the battle cannon with a shorter barreled siege cannon that fires massive shells at reduced range, but with devastating effect against fortifications. The demolisher's shells can collapse bunkers with single hits and create breaches in fortress walls that would require multiple strikes from standard battle cannons. The Macharius heavy tank appears in Death Korps armored formations more frequently than in most Imperial Guard forces. This super heavy vehicle mounts weapons comparable to those found on Baneblade tanks, but in a chassis that proves easier to maintain and repair with the limited resources available during extended siege operations. The Macharius carries a twin-linked battle cannon in its main turret, supplemented by hull-mounted heavy bolters and sponson-mounted weapons that vary depending on the specific variant. The tank's armor provides protection against all but the most powerful anti-tank weapons, allowing it to advance directly against enemy fortifications while supporting infantry assaults. The crew of 6 soldiers operates the various weapon systems and manages the vehicle's movement, with each crew member trained to assume multiple roles in case casualties reduce the tank's complement during combat. The Death Korps' preference for durable, maintainable vehicles stems from the practical realities of siege warfare, where supply lines remain vulnerable and combat operations continue for months or years without pause. The tanks must function in environments contaminated by chemical weapons, radioactive fallout, and the pervasive dust generated by constant artillery bombardment. The crews cannot rely on pristine maintenance facilities or abundant spare parts, instead performing repairs in the field using whatever materials they can salvage from destroyed vehicles or fabricate from available resources. The Liman Russ and Macharius designs prove well suited to these conditions. They're relatively simple mechanical systems, allowing crews to maintain operational capability even after suffering damage that would disable more sophisticated vehicles. The Death Riders of Krieg represent a unique formation that combines traditional cavalry tactics with the specialized equipment necessary for operations in toxic environments. The horses bred on Krieg stand approximately 14 to 15 hands high, descended from stock that survived the nuclear devastation through a combination of natural radiation resistance and selective breeding programs implemented during the 500-year siege. These animals possess enhanced lung capacity that allows them to function effectively while wearing the specialized rebreather apparatus fitted to their muzzles, and their hooves demonstrate unusual resistance to the chemical contamination that saturates the ground on many battlefields where Death Korps forces operate. The Death Riders' equipment includes a hunting lance approximately 3 meters in length, constructed from reinforced metal alloys that provide the strength necessary to penetrate enemy armor during shock cavalry charges. The lance features a power field generator in its tip, activated during the final moments of a charge to enhance its penetrating power against heavily armored targets. The riders carry las pistols or bolt pistols in saddle holsters for ranged combat, along with demolition charges for use in raids against enemy supply depots or command facilities. The saddle and tack incorporate sealed connections to the rider's equipment, allowing the Death Rider to remain connected to his mount's rebreather system and creating a partially enclosed environment that provides enhanced protection against chemical weapons. The Grenadier formations within Death Korps regiments represent elite troops selected from standard infantry based on demonstrated combat effectiveness and survival through multiple campaigns. These soldiers receive enhanced equipment, including carapace armor, that provides superior protection compared to standard flak armor, though at the cost of increased weight and reduced mobility. The Grenadiers carry hellguns instead of standard lasguns, the more powerful weapons drawing energy from backpack power supplies that limit ammunition capacity, but provide significantly enhanced armor penetration. The Grenadier squads include specialists armed with meltaguns, plasma guns, and heavy weapons that allow them to engage hardened targets that would resist attacks from standard infantry. The combat engineer squads equipped for tunnel fighting and fortification destruction operate with specialized equipment designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. These engineers carry shotguns loaded with solid slugs effective in the close ranges typical of tunnel fighting, along with compact flamers that can clear enemy positions without risking the over-penetration common with lasguns in enclosed spaces. The engineers wear modified armor with enhanced protection for the head and upper body, recognizing that tunnel fighting typically involves enemies firing from prepared positions where they can aim carefully at exposed targets. The squads carry extensive demolition equipment, including shaped charges, det cord for cutting through metal barriers, and specialized tools for detecting and disarming enemy explosives that might be positioned to collapse tunnels on advancing troops. The artillery support available to Death Korps regiments emphasizes indirect fire weapons capable of sustained bombardment against enemy fortifications. The standard artillery piece deployed by Krieg forces is the Earthshaker cannon, a long-barreled gun that fires shells to ranges exceeding 15 kilometers. The Earthshaker crews position their guns in protected emplacements behind the front lines, from where they conduct fire missions directed by forward observers operating in the frontline trenches. The Death Korps employs chemical shells more extensively than most Imperial Guard forces, loading their Earthshakers with toxin payloads that contaminate enemy positions and force defenders to maintain sealed equipment that reduces their combat effectiveness. The artillery batteries maintain firing schedules that subject enemy positions to nearly continuous bombardment during major operations, with each gun firing approximately one shell every 2 minutes during sustained fire missions. The Thud gun represents a lighter artillery piece employed by Death Korps forces for direct support of infantry operations. This weapon fires smaller shells at a higher rate than the Earthshaker, providing responsive fire support that can be adjusted rapidly as infantry advances across no man's land. The Thud gun's crew of 3 soldiers can disassemble the weapon and transport it through trench systems, allowing them to reposition to support shifting tactical situations. The weapon proves particularly effective against enemy infantry concentrations and lightly fortified positions, though it lacks the power to engage heavily armored targets or destroy substantial fortifications. The logistical requirements for maintaining Death Korps equipment in combat zones present substantial challenges for the Munitorum officials responsible for supporting these formations. The constant consumption of rebreather filters alone requires dedicated supply chains delivering thousands of replacement canisters daily to regiments conducting active operations. The specialized ammunition employed by Death Korps forces, including chemical weapons and the various exotic shells fired by their artillery, must be manufactured to precise specifications and transported under conditions that prevent premature detonation or contamination. The repair parts for vehicles operating in toxic environments wear out more rapidly than those in conventional service, requiring increased allocation of spare components and maintenance supplies. The Death Korps' approach to siege warfare represents the culmination of 5 centuries of continuous combat in environments where conventional tactical doctrine fails. The methodology employed by Krieg regiments begins with comprehensive reconnaissance of enemy fortifications, conducted by forward observers who spend days or weeks cataloging defensive positions, identifying firing arcs, and mapping obstacle systems. These observers operate in no man's land between the opposing forces, concealed in shell craters or partially collapsed structures, recording detailed information about enemy trench layouts, bunker locations, and the positioning of artillery and heavy weapons. The intelligence gathered during this phase informs every subsequent decision regarding the siege operation, from the placement of friendly artillery batteries to the selection of assault routes for infantry attacks. The construction of trench systems represents the foundation of Death Korps siege operations. The engineers begin excavation work at distances beyond effective enemy small arms range, typically 3 to 5 kilometers from enemy positions depending on terrain. The initial trenches run parallel to enemy lines, creating a forward defensive position that protects the main assault forces from counterattacks while construction continues. These first trenches reach depths of approximately 2 meters, sufficient to protect soldiers from direct fire and provide some shielding against artillery fragments. The excavated soil forms parapets on the enemy-facing side of the trench, with sandbags or wooden revetments reinforcing the earthworks to prevent collapse during bombardment. The sap trenches that extend from the parallel trenches toward enemy positions follow zigzag patterns that prevent enemy fire from enfilading their length. The engineers advance these approach trenches at rates of 10 to 20 meters per day under optimal conditions, though enemy artillery and counterattacks frequently slow progress. The sappers work in shifts around the clock, with some soldiers excavating, while others provide security against enemy raiding parties that attempt to disrupt construction. The zigzag pattern requires careful surveying to ensure the trenches maintain their intended direction toward target objectives, while providing adequate protection for the troops who will advance through them during assault operations. The artillery bombardment protocols employed by Death Korps forces emphasize systematic destruction of enemy defensive capabilities through sustained fire over extended periods. The initial phase of bombardment targets enemy artillery positions, attempting to suppress or destroy the guns that could interfere with friendly trench construction and future assault operations. Forward observers direct fire onto identified battery positions, adjusting aim based on observed impacts until enemy guns fall silent either through destruction or forced relocation. This counter-battery phase typically continues for several days, with Death Korps artillery maintaining firing schedules that allow minimal rest for enemy gun crews. The second bombardment phase shifts focus to enemy fortifications and defensive positions. The Earthshaker batteries fire high explosive shells against bunkers, trenches, and strongpoints, methodically working through target lists compiled during the reconnaissance phase. The gunners employ time-on-target techniques where multiple batteries coordinate their fire to achieve simultaneous impact on specific objectives, overwhelming enemy defenses through concentrated destruction rather than dispersed harassment. Chemical shells supplement high-explosive ammunition, contaminating enemy positions and forcing defenders to maintain sealed equipment that reduces their combat effectiveness and increases physical exhaustion. The bombardment continues for days or weeks depending on the strength of enemy fortifications, with ammunition expenditure rates that would horrify Munitorum officials accustomed to more economical approaches. The infantry assault tactics employed by Death Korps regiments reflect their fundamental acceptance of massive casualties as the necessary cost of achieving breakthrough against prepared defenses. The assault waves form in the forward trenches during the final hours of artillery preparation, with soldiers packed into the excavated spaces at densities that leave minimal room for movement. The company and platoon watchmasters conduct final equipment inspections, ensuring every soldier carries adequate ammunition and that rebreather systems function properly. The troops receive their assault objectives through written orders rather than verbal briefings, as the noise of ongoing artillery bombardment makes spoken communication impossible even at close range. The assault begins when artillery shifts from enemy front-line positions to deeper targets, a transition coordinated through precise timing rather than communication between infantry and artillery commanders. The soldiers climb from their trenches and advance across no man's land in waves, spaced approximately 50 meters apart, each wave consisting of a full company of 300 troops moving in extended line formation. The first wave accepts the mission of breaching enemy wire obstacles and suppressing defensive positions, understanding that their casualties will likely exceed 70% before they reach enemy trenches. The soldiers advance at a walking pace rather than running, conserving energy for the close combat that awaits in enemy positions, while presenting steady targets that enemy defenders find difficult to miss. The acceptable casualty ratios calculated by Death Korps commanders reflect mathematical assessments of force requirements rather than humanitarian concerns. A typical assault against prepared defenses assumes first wave losses of 70 to 80%, second wave losses of 50 to 60%, and third wave losses of 30 to 40%, as enemy defensive fire diminishes through ammunition exhaustion and the psychological impact of facing troops who continue advancing despite catastrophic losses. The Death Korps commits sufficient forces to ensure that enough soldiers survive to reach enemy positions and conduct close combat clearing operations, typically allocating 3 full regiments to assault objectives that other Imperial Guard forces might attack with a single regiment supported by extensive armor and air support. The coordination between artillery, armor, and infantry during breakthrough operations follows rigid procedures developed through centuries of siege warfare experience. The artillery maintains firing schedules that suppress enemy positions immediately adjacent to assault routes, while avoiding friendly forces advancing through designated corridors. The timing calculations account for the walking pace of infantry advance and the known range of friendly artillery, creating a moving barrage that stays approximately 100 meters ahead of the assault waves. Tank squadrons advance behind the 2nd Infantry Wave, using the cover provided by the initial assault troops to close within effective range of enemy positions before engaging with their main guns and hull weapons. The breakthrough phase transitions to exploitation when sufficient friendly forces occupy enemy trenches to prevent immediate counterattack. The follow-on waves that advance through captured positions bring engineering equipment and construction materials, immediately beginning work to reverse enemy fortifications and create defensive positions facing toward enemy-held territory. The Death Korps doctrine assumes that every captured position will face counterattack and plans accordingly, with engineers strengthening defenses and infantry preparing firing positions before enemy reserves can organize their response. The armor that supported the initial assault advances beyond captured trenches to interdict enemy reinforcement routes, accepting losses to direct fire from anti-tank weapons in exchange for delaying enemy counterattacks long enough for infantry to consolidate their gains. The Death Korps' reputation for holding defensive positions at any cost stems from their tactical doctrine regarding the sanctity of ground once captured. A Death Korps unit ordered to hold a position interprets those orders as absolute, with no provision for tactical withdrawal regardless of casualties suffered or changes in the broader tactical situation. The defending troops establish interlocking fields of fire that cover all approaches to their positions, position heavy weapons to engage enemy armor, and prepare fallback positions within their defensive perimeter for use after forward positions become untenable. The soldiers understand that they will likely die in place rather than retreat, and they prepare accordingly by stockpiling ammunition at fighting positions and ensuring that wounded soldiers who can still fire weapons remain in the line rather than seeking medical evacuation. The counter-siege operations conducted by Death Korps forces demonstrate their expertise in both offensive and defensive aspects of siege warfare. When defending against enemy siege operations, the Death Korps employs aggressive patrolling and raiding tactics designed to disrupt enemy trench construction and inflict casualties on engineer units. The raiding parties infiltrate across no man's land during periods of reduced visibility, approaching enemy sap trenches and launching sudden attacks against construction crews. These raids inflict limited tactical damage, but force enemy commanders to allocate additional troops to security duties, slowing the pace of siege operations and increasing the time required for enemy forces to close assault distance. The Death Korps defensive doctrine emphasizes the construction of multiple defensive lines that force attacking enemies to fight through successive positions rather than achieving breakthrough with a single assault. The forward defensive line occupies positions designed to be expendable, with minimal troops assigned to delay enemy advances while inflicting maximum casualties through prepared fields of fire and extensive obstacle systems. The main defensive line sits several hundred meters behind the forward positions, occupying ground selected for optimal fields of fire and ease of supply. The reserve line provides fallback positions in case the main line becomes untenable, though Death Korps doctrine rarely permits withdrawal to these positions except under direct orders from regimental command. The effectiveness of Death Korps forces in protracted campaigns where other regiments would falter derives from their psychological conditioning and the systematic replacement of casualties through Krieg's Vidi Womb facilities. Standard Imperial Guard regiments suffer morale degradation after extended combat operations, with soldiers becoming increasingly reluctant to expose themselves to danger as they witness the deaths of comrades and experience the cumulative stress of constant combat. The Death Korps soldiers experience no such degradation, their conditioning eliminating the psychological factors that cause other troops to become combat ineffective despite remaining physically capable of fighting. A Death Korps regiment maintains the same tactical effectiveness after 6 months of continuous combat as it demonstrated during its first engagement, with the only limiting factor being physical casualties rather than morale collapse. The logistical advantages of Death Korps doctrine in protracted campaigns include their minimal requirements for amenities that other regiments consider essential. The troops require no recreational facilities, no morale-boosting activities, and no rotation away from front-line positions for rest periods. The soldiers sleep in their fighting positions when tactical situations permit, consume their rations without complaint regardless of quality or variety, and continue operations despite environmental conditions that would render other troops' combat ineffective. This reduction in support requirements allows Death Korps regiments to operate on supply chains that focus purely on ammunition, equipment, and basic rations, simplifying logistics and reducing the transportation capacity needed to sustain combat operations. The weaknesses inherent in Death Korps tactical doctrine become apparent when circumstances require rapid maneuver warfare or operations that demand tactical flexibility. The Krieg approach to combat emphasizes methodical preparation and systematic execution of predetermined plans, characteristics that prove advantageous in siege operations, but which become liabilities when facing mobile enemies or fluid tactical situations. A Death Korps regiment ordered to pursue retreating enemies or conduct rapid exploitation of breakthrough opportunities moves at the same deliberate pace it employs during trench assaults, allowing enemy forces to disengage and establish new defensive positions. The Watchmasters who command Death Korps units possess extensive expertise in siege warfare but limited experience with the mobile operations that characterize many Imperial Guard campaigns. The inflexibility of Death Korps tactical responses stems from their training methodology and psychological conditioning. The soldiers learn specific procedures for specific tactical situations, practicing these procedures until they can execute them without conscious thought, even under extreme stress. This approach produces troops who perform reliably in the circumstances they trained for but who struggle to adapt when facing unexpected situations. A Death Korps squad encountering enemy forces in terrain that differs from the trench systems where they train defaults to the tactics they know, advancing in line formation and attempting to close combat range even when the tactical situation would favor different approaches. The Watchmasters recognize these limitations, but lack the authority to deviate from established doctrine, as their training emphasizes adherence to approved procedures rather than independent tactical decision-making. The over-reliance on attrition tactics creates situations where Death Korps forces suffer unnecessary casualties, attempting to achieve objectives that alternative approaches might accomplish more efficiently. The doctrine assumes that sufficient casualties will eventually overwhelm any defense, a mathematically sound position when forces possess the numbers to absorb losses and maintain offensive pressure. However, this approach becomes problematic when facing enemies who employ mobile defense tactics, trading space for time while inflicting casualties on advancing Death Korps forces without committing to decisive engagement. The Krieg commanders continue their methodical advances even as casualty figures climb, trusting that their systematic approach will eventually force enemy collapse despite mounting evidence that the tactical situation requires different methods. The logistical challenges of Death Korps operations stem from their equipment-intensive approach to warfare and their enormous ammunition consumption rates. A single Death Korps regiment conducting active siege operations requires daily delivery of approximately 500 tons of supplies, including artillery ammunition, lasgun power packs, rebreather filters, and engineering materials. The specialized nature of much Death Korps equipment means that supply chains cannot substitute standard Imperial Guard materiel when Krieg-specific items become unavailable, forcing logistics officers to maintain separate supply lines for Death Korps formations, even when they operate alongside conventional regiments. The Munitorum officials responsible for supporting Death Korps deployments must allocate transportation assets that could otherwise support multiple standard regiments, creating competition for limited shipping capacity and occasionally resulting in supply shortages that degrade combat effectiveness. The chemical and biological weapons employed by Death Korps forces create additional logistical complications and political difficulties. The storage and transportation of these weapons requires specialized facilities and trained personnel, as accidental release during transit could contaminate entire transport ships or supply depots. The use of such weapons on Imperial worlds, or in circumstances where civilian populations might suffer exposure, generates protests from planetary governors and administratum officials concerned about collateral damage. The Death Korps forces employ these weapons without regard for such concerns, viewing chemical and biological agents as simply another category of ammunition to be expended in pursuit of tactical objectives. The resulting friction between Death Korps commanders and Imperial authorities sometimes escalates to the point where Munitorum officials restrict the deployment of Krieg regiments to specific theaters where their methods will generate minimal political complications. The maintenance requirements for Death Korps equipment in extended campaigns strain the technical support capabilities of most Imperial Guard logistics networks. The sealed armor systems and rebreather apparatus require regular servicing by trained technicians, with replacement parts that must meet precise specifications to maintain the environmental protection these systems provide. The vehicles operated by Death Korps armored regiments accumulate wear at accelerated rates due to operations in contaminated environments, requiring more frequent replacement of filters, seals, and components exposed to corrosive atmospheres. The artillery pieces that sustain the massive bombardments characteristic of Death Korps operations wear out their barrels more rapidly than guns in conventional service, necessitating replacement schedules that consume manufacturing capacity and transportation resources. The tactical employment of Death Korps forces by higher-level Imperial Guard commanders requires understanding both their exceptional capabilities and their significant limitations. Commanders who successfully integrate Death Korps regiments into larger operations assign them missions that exploit their strengths in siege warfare and operations in hostile environments, while avoiding situations that expose their weaknesses in mobile warfare. The Death Korps excels at reducing fortified positions that would require months for conventional forces to capture, at holding critical terrain against overwhelming enemy attacks, and at conducting operations in toxic or irradiated environments where other troops cannot function. These capabilities make Death Korps regiments invaluable assets for specific tactical situations, though their limitations mean they cannot serve as general-purpose infantry suitable for all combat scenarios. The Siege of Vrac stands as the defining campaign in Death Korps military history, a 17-year war of attrition that consumed millions of lives and demonstrated both the exceptional capabilities and terrible costs inherent in Krieg's approach to warfare. The conflict began in 813 of the 41st millennium when Cardinal Zaffin, the corrupt master of Vrax Prime, declared his independence from the Imperium and aligned himself with the ruinous powers. Vrax Prime occupied strategic importance as a major munitions depot world. Its vast underground storage facilities containing weapons and equipment stockpiled for use by Imperial Guard forces throughout the Scaras sector. The loss of these supplies represented an unacceptable blow to Imperial military capability in the region, prompting the Adeptus Munitorum to authorize a full-scale military operation to reclaim the planet. The Death Korps of Krieg received deployment orders as the primary assault force for the Vrax campaign, with the initial deployment consisting of 8 full regiments totaling approximately 24,000 troops. The Munitorum selected Death Korps forces specifically for this operation based on their expertise in siege warfare and their demonstrated ability to sustain combat operations despite massive casualties. The defending forces under Cardinal Zaffin's command numbered approximately 14 million troops, including planetary defense forces, that had received extensive training and fortification of Vrax Prime's already substantial defensive works. The heretic forces occupied defensive positions centered on the citadel of Vrax, a massive fortress complex that controlled access to the underground storage facilities and dominated the surrounding terrain. The Death Korps forces established their initial positions approximately 15 kilometers from the outer defensive perimeter of the citadel, beginning the construction of trench systems that would eventually extend across hundreds of square kilometers of Vrax Prime's surface. The first months of the campaign followed standard Death Korps siege doctrine, with engineers excavating approach trenches while artillery batteries subjected enemy positions to sustained bombardment. The defenders responded with their own artillery fire and launched counterattacks against the advancing trench lines, inflicting steady casualties on the Death Korps forces, but failing to halt the methodical advance toward the citadel's outer defenses. The scale of the Vrax campaign expanded dramatically as the siege progressed, and the Munitorum recognized that the initial force commitment proved insufficient to achieve breakthrough against the heavily fortified defensive positions. Additional Death Korps regiments arrived in successive waves, with the total commitment eventually reaching over 20 corps, comprising millions of soldiers. The regiments deployed to Vrax came from across Krieg's various hive complexes, each bringing their standard equipment loads and the grim determination that characterized all forces raised from the Death World. The logistics required to support this massive deployment strained Imperial Navy transportation capacity, with supply convoys making continuous runs between Krieg and Vrax to deliver the ammunition, equipment, and replacement troops necessary to sustain the offensive. The breakthrough attempts against Vrax Prime's defensive lines demonstrated the Death Korps methodology of accepting catastrophic casualties to achieve tactical objectives. The assault on the outer defensive perimeter in 815 of the 41st Millennium involved simultaneous attacks by 12 Death Korps regiments, approximately 36,000 troops advancing across open ground against prepared defensive positions. The defenders occupied fortified bunkers and trench systems protected by extensive wire obstacles and minefields, with interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches to their positions. The Death Korps soldiers advanced through the killing zones in their characteristic walking pace, maintaining formation discipline as defensive fire cut down entire companies in the opening minutes of the assault. The first wave suffered losses exceeding 80% before reaching the enemy wire obstacles, with the survivors attempting to breach the barriers while under continuous fire from defensive positions. The second wave advanced through the bodies of the first, bringing demolition charges and wire cutters to create paths through the obstacles. The third wave exploited these breaches to reach the enemy trenches, where close-quarters combat erupted as Death Korps soldiers fought hand-to-hand with defenders who refused to abandon their positions. The assault achieved penetration of the outer defensive line at a cost of approximately 28,000 casualties, with the surviving Death Korps forces immediately beginning construction of defensive works to consolidate their gains against inevitable counterattacks. The intervention of Chaos Space Marines fighting alongside the heretic defenders added a dimension to the Vrax campaign that Death Korps forces had not previously encountered. The traitor legionaries possessed combat capabilities that exceeded those of any enemy the Death Korps had faced during their 500-year civil war, or in subsequent campaigns against conventional Imperial enemies. The Chaos Marines launched counterattacks that shattered Death Korps' defensive positions, their power armor rendering them nearly impervious to lasgun fire, and their enhanced strength allowing them to kill multiple soldiers in close combat before falling to concentrated fire. The Death Korps adapted their tactics to account for these superhuman enemies, employing massed artillery bombardments and concentrated heavy weapons fire to suppress Chaos Marine advances, while accepting that infantry units engaged in close combat with traitor legionaries faced near certain annihilation. The grinding nature of the Vrax campaign settled into a pattern of incremental advances measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, with each gain requiring weeks of preparation and resulting in casualty figures that would have broken the will of conventional Imperial Guard forces. The Death Korps regiments rotated through frontline positions on schedules that kept troops in combat for months at a time, with replacement soldiers arriving from Krieg to fill the gaps left by casualties. The trench systems expanded into vast networks that extended across the battlefield, with some sections reaching depths of 10 meters below the surface and incorporating multiple defensive lines connected by communication trenches and supply tunnels. The deployment of armored forces during the Vrax campaign highlighted both the strengths and limitations of Death Korps tank regiments in siege warfare environments. The armored columns advanced in support of infantry assaults, providing direct fire support against enemy bunkers and strongpoints, while accepting losses to mines, anti-tank weapons, and enemy armor. The Death Korps tank crews demonstrated their characteristic disregard for casualties, continuing to advance even after suffering hits that killed crew members or damaged vehicle systems. Individual tanks frequently fought on with reduced crews, their surviving members performing multiple roles to keep their vehicles operational until catastrophic damage or complete crew loss forced abandonment. The chemical weapons employment during the Vrax campaign occurred on a scale unprecedented in recent Imperial Guard operations. The Death Korps artillery batteries fired chemical shells that contaminated enemy positions with toxins designed to penetrate defensive equipment and force defenders to maintain sealed suits that reduced combat effectiveness. The defenders responded with their own chemical weapons, creating battlefield conditions where both sides operated in toxic atmospheres that required constant use of protective equipment. The Death Korps forces maintained their operational effectiveness in these conditions through their extensive training and the superior quality of their rebreather systems, while Defender forces suffered degraded combat capability as their equipment failed or exhausted its protective capacity. The introduction of Titans to the Vrax battlefield marked a shift in the campaign's character, with the massive war machines providing the firepower necessary to breach defensive positions that had resisted conventional assault. The Legio Metallica deployed several of its God machines to support Death Korps operations, with the Titans advancing across no man's land to engage enemy fortifications with their massive weapons. The Death Korps infantry followed in the wake of these advances, exploiting the destruction created by Titan weapons to penetrate enemy lines and establish new forward positions. The coordination between Titan forces and Death Korps regiments demonstrated the ability of Krieg commanders to integrate their forces into combined arms operations, despite their doctrinal emphasis on infantry-centric siege warfare. The final assault on the citadel of Vrax in 830 of the 41st Millennium involved the commitment of the campaign's remaining effective forces in a massive offensive that accepted complete destruction of the attacking forces as the acceptable cost of achieving the mission objective. The Death Korps regiments advanced against the citadel's inner defenses in waves that sustained losses approaching 90% in some units, with the survivors fighting through the fortress complex in room-to-room combat that lasted for weeks. The capture of the citadel came at a total cost of approximately 14 million Imperial casualties, the majority suffered by Death Korps regiments, whose methodology of accepting massive losses to achieve breakthrough had proven both effective and horrifically expensive. The Orphean War presented the Death Korps with an entirely different category of enemy, when several regiments deployed to counter Necron forces emerging from tomb complexes in the Orpheus sector. The campaign began in 975 of the 41st Millennium, when Necron dynasties awakened and launched attacks against Imperial worlds in the sector, their forces employing technology that rendered conventional Imperial Guard tactics ineffective. The Death Korps regiments assigned to the Orphean War discovered that their standard approach of accepting casualties to overwhelm enemy positions failed against Necron forces, whose warriors reanimated after suffering damage that would permanently eliminate organic soldiers. The adaptation of Death Korps tactics to counter Necron reanimation protocols required modifications to their assault methodology. The regiments learned to concentrate fire on individual Necron warriors to inflict sufficient damage that their self-repair systems could not restore functionality, rather than dispersing fire across multiple targets as they would against organic enemies. The Death Korps forces employed heavy weapons and demolition charges more extensively than in conventional operations, using meltaguns and las cannons to inflict the catastrophic damage necessary to prevent Necron reanimation. The artillery batteries adjusted their fire missions to include sustained bombardment of areas where Necron forces had fallen, denying the Xenos the time necessary for their warriors to restore themselves to combat capability. The Death Korps' effectiveness against Necron forces stemmed partially from their psychological conditioning, which eliminated the morale effects that Necron weapons and tactics inflicted on conventional troops. The Gauss weapons employed by Necron warriors disintegrated targets at the molecular level, creating horrific casualties that broke the will of many Imperial Guard units. The Death Korps soldiers witnessed their comrades reduced to constituent atoms without displaying any degradation in combat effectiveness, continuing their advances with the same mechanical determination they showed against any enemy. The Necron forces, accustomed to breaking enemy morale through the demonstration of their technological superiority and the terror induced by their inexorable advance, found themselves facing an opponent immune to psychological warfare. The siege operations conducted during the Orphean War against Necron tomb complexes required the Death Korps to develop new techniques for breaching defenses that incorporated technology beyond Imperial understanding. The tomb complexes featured living metal walls that repaired damage automatically, force fields that deflected conventional weapons fire, and defensive systems that employed weapons of unknown function. The Death Korps engineers employed sustained bombardment with the heaviest weapons available, including Titan-scale guns and orbital fire support, to overwhelm the Necron defensive systems through sheer destructive power rather than precise targeting of weak points. The infantry assaults into breached tomb complexes accepted catastrophic casualties as the cost of advancing through corridors where Necron warriors materialized from dimensional portals and defensive systems activated automated weapon platforms. The defense of Hive Acheron during the Third War for Armageddon demonstrated Death Korps capabilities in urban warfare against Orc forces, whose approach to combat differed fundamentally from the methodical siege operations, where Krieg forces normally excelled. The Death Korps regiments deployed to Armageddon in 998 of the 41st Millennium received assignment to hold critical industrial sectors in Hive Acheron against Orc invasion forces that employed massed infantry assaults supported by crude but effective armor and artillery. The urban environment of the Hive city created tactical conditions where the Death Korps could not employ their standard trench warfare methodology, forcing adaptation to building fighting in manufactorum districts and hab block complexes. The Death Korps forces established defensive positions throughout the assigned sectors of Hive Acheron, fortifying industrial facilities and creating interlocking fields of fire across the streets and plazas between structures. The soldiers employed their entrenching tools to create firing positions in building walls, positioned heavy weapons to cover approach routes, and prepared demolition charges to collapse structures on advancing Orc forces. The defensive preparations reflected Death Korps doctrine adapted to urban terrain, with the same emphasis on prepared positions and systematic defense that characterized their trench warfare operations. The Orc assaults against Death Korps positions in Hive Acheron involved massive waves of greenskin infantry advancing through the industrial sectors with characteristic disregard for casualties. The Death Korps defenders maintained disciplined fire from their prepared positions, cutting down Orcs in carefully measured volleys that maximized ammunition efficiency while maintaining continuous fire. The Orcs eventually closed to melee range despite suffering catastrophic losses during their advances, initiating close quarters combat, where their physical strength and ferocity created tactical advantages. The Death Korps soldiers fought hand-to-hand with the same mechanical efficiency they displayed in ranged combat, using their entrenching tools and bayonets to kill orcs in brutal exchanges that resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The Death Korps held their assigned sectors throughout the duration of the Third War for Armageddon, maintaining defensive positions, even as orc forces overran adjacent areas held by other Imperial Guard regiments. The Krieg commanders refused all suggestions to withdraw to more defensible positions, interpreting their orders to hold the industrial sectors as absolute regardless of the tactical situation developing around them. The regiments suffered casualties approaching 70% during the campaign, but maintained combat effectiveness through the arrival of replacement troops from Krieg and the integration of these reinforcements into existing unit structures without disruption to defensive operations. The participation of Death Korps regiments in the Sabbat World's crusade occurred across multiple theaters and involved operations ranging from conventional siege warfare to mobile campaigns that challenged the limitations of Krieg tactical doctrine. Several Death Korps regiments deployed to the crusade beginning in the late 41st millennium, assigned to reduction of fortified worlds that had fallen under the control of chaos forces. The regiments conducted siege operations that followed their standard methodology, constructing trench systems and conducting methodical advances against enemy fortifications, while accepting the massive casualties inherent in their approach. The effectiveness of Death Korps forces in the Sabbat worlds varied depending on the specific tactical situations they encountered. On worlds where enemy forces occupied prepared defensive positions and the terrain permitted conventional siege operations, the Death Korps regiments performed with their characteristic efficiency, reducing fortifications through sustained bombardment and infantry assault. On worlds where enemy forces employed mobile defense tactics, or where the terrain prevented the construction of extensive trench systems, the Death Korps struggled to achieve their objectives, their inflexible tactical doctrine proving poorly suited to fluid operational environments. The various siege operations conducted by Death Korps regiments across the Segmentum Tempestus and other regions of Imperial space demonstrated the consistent application of their tactical methodology, regardless of the specific enemy or terrain encountered. The regiments deployed to counter chaos incursions, suppress rebellions on Imperial worlds, and conduct offensive operations against Xeno's forces occupying territory claimed by the Imperium. Each deployment followed similar patterns, with the Death Korps forces establishing their characteristic trench systems, conducting sustained artillery bombardment, and launching infantry assaults that accepted massive casualties to achieve breakthrough against enemy defensive positions. The cumulative casualties suffered by Death Korps regiments across these various campaigns reached figures that would have required centuries for conventional Imperial worlds to replace through natural population growth. Krieg's Vidi-Womb facilities maintained production schedules that generated sufficient replacement troops to sustain the Death Korps at operational strength, despite the constant attrition of combat operations. The regiments departing Krieg for deployment to active campaigns received full complements of soldiers, equipment, and supplies, with no indication that the planet's capacity to raise and equip forces had diminished despite the enormous losses suffered in previous operations. The reputation earned by Death Korps regiments through their performance in these campaigns made them highly valued assets for Imperial Guard commanders facing operations that required troops willing to accept catastrophic casualties to achieve objectives. The Adeptus Archives maintained waiting lists of requests for Death Korps deployments, with demand for these specialized forces consistently exceeding the supply available from Krieg's recruitment capacity. The regiments deployed to the most hazardous operations across the Imperium, their presence on a battlefield serving as indication that the campaign involved circumstances where conventional Imperial Guard forces would prove insufficient, and where success required soldiers who viewed their own deaths as acceptable costs rather than outcomes to be avoided. The reputation of the Death Korps within the broader structures of the Imperial Guard exists as a study in contradictions that reveals fundamental tensions in Imperial military culture. Other regiments regard Krieg forces with a mixture of respect, unease, and occasionally outright revulsion at their methods and mentality. The Cadian regiments, renowned throughout the Imperium for their discipline and martial prowess, acknowledge the Death Korps as exceptional soldiers while privately expressing discomfort at their complete absence of self-preservation instinct. Cadian officers who have coordinated operations with Death Korps forces report that Krieg commanders calculate acceptable casualty rates that would constitute catastrophic losses for any conventional regiment, treating their soldiers as expendable ammunition rather than valuable personnel whose survival contributes to long-term combat effectiveness. The Catachan jungle fighters, whose culture emphasizes individual initiative and survival skills honed in the deadliest environment in the Imperium, find the Death Korps methodology fundamentally alien to their operational philosophy. Catachan veterans describe watching Death Korps soldiers advance into obvious kill zones without attempting to use terrain for cover, maintaining parade ground formations while suffering casualties that would cause Catachan units to immediately seek concealment and approach from alternative angles. The cultural gap between regiments that value individual skill and those that view soldiers as interchangeable components creates friction during joint operations, with Catachan commanders sometimes refusing to position their troops adjacent to Death Korps forces whose suicidal tactics might compromise the defensive integrity of the broader front. The Vestroyan Firstborn, another regiment known for discipline and adherence to military tradition, express grudging admiration for Death Korps' combat effectiveness while questioning whether their methods truly serve the Emperor's interests. Vestroyan officers note that Death Korps regiments accomplish objectives that would require months for conventional forces to achieve, but they question whether the massive casualties suffered in the process represent efficient use of Imperial military resources. The Vestroyans maintain their own traditions of sacrifice and duty, having sworn oaths to redeem their world's ancient failure to provide troops during a critical campaign, yet they view the Krieg interpretation of atonement as excessive to the point of waste. The Mordian Iron Guard, whose rigid discipline and formal military bearing superficially resemble Death Korps characteristics, nevertheless maintain fundamental differences in their approach to warfare. The Mordians fight with precise coordination and adherence to tactical doctrine, but their commanders retain flexibility to adapt plans when circumstances change and their soldiers possess survival instincts that inform tactical decisions. Mordian officers who observe Death Korps operations note that Krieg forces execute their orders with machine-like precision, but lack the capacity to recognize when those orders have become obsolete due to changing battlefield conditions. The Mordians view this inflexibility as a critical weakness that undermines the Death Korps' otherwise impressive combat capabilities. The Commissariat's relationship with Death Korps regiments represents a complete inversion of normal commissar functions within the Imperial Guard. Commissars assigned to conventional regiments spend their time monitoring for signs of cowardice, executing soldiers who attempt to flee from combat, and delivering inspirational speeches to maintain morale during difficult campaigns. Those assigned to Death Korps forces instead find themselves restraining soldiers from suicidal actions, ordering withdrawals that Krieg officers would never initiate independently, and preventing the waste of lives in attacks that cannot succeed regardless of casualties accepted. The commissars who adapt successfully to service with Death Korps regiments develop specialized skills in calculating the minimum force necessary to achieve objectives, recognizing when Krieg determination crosses the line from admirable devotion into pointless sacrifice. The Schola Progenium maintains specific training programs for commissars destined for Death Korps service, recognizing that standard commissarial education proves inadequate preparation for the unique challenges these assignments present. The curriculum includes extensive instruction in siege warfare tactics, analysis of historical campaigns where attrition warfare succeeded or failed, and psychological preparation for commanding troops whose conditioning eliminates normal human responses to danger and death. The commissars receive training in identifying when Death Korps' tactical approaches serve strategic objectives versus when they simply waste lives through inflexible adherence to doctrine unsuited to specific circumstances. Many commissars request transfers away from Death Korps service after single deployments, finding the experience of commanding soldiers who actively seek death rather than fearing it deeply disturbing despite their own conditioning to accept casualties as necessary costs of war. The strategic value of Death Korps regiments to the Adeptus Militarum stems from their unique capabilities in specific tactical situations that conventional Imperial Guard forces cannot address effectively. The Militarum maintains detailed records of campaign types where Death Korps deployment provides optimal results, including reduction of heavily fortified positions, operations in toxic or irradiated environments, and defensive missions where holding terrain takes absolute priority over casualty minimization. The bureaucrats responsible for force allocation across the Imperium's countless war zones view Death Korps regiments as specialized tools to be employed when circumstances match their capabilities, rather than as general-purpose infantry suitable for all combat scenarios. The preferred deployment patterns for Death Korps forces concentrate them in grinding attritional campaigns, where their willingness to accept massive casualties provides decisive advantages. The siege of fortified worlds occupied by chaos forces represents the ideal employment scenario, where enemy defensive positions require sustained assault over months or years, and where conventional regiments would suffer morale collapse long before achieving breakthrough. The Death Korps methodology of systematic trench construction, sustained artillery bombardment, and infantry assaults that accept 70 to 80% casualties proves effective in these circumstances despite horrifying human costs. The Militarum calculates that deploying Death Korps regiments to such operations actually reduces total Imperial casualties compared to committing multiple conventional regiments that would require years to achieve the same objectives while suffering cumulative losses approaching Death Korps casualty rates. The political considerations surrounding Death Korps deployment create complications that force Militarum officials to balance military effectiveness against diplomatic concerns. Planetary governors whose worlds face liberation from enemy occupation often object to Death Korps involvement, fearing that Krieg forces will employ chemical weapons that contaminate their planets, or that the massive casualties inherent in Death Korps operations will result in unacceptable collateral damage to civilian populations and infrastructure. The Administratum receives regular complaints from governors whose worlds were reclaimed through Death Korps campaigns, detailing the environmental damage caused by chemical weapons employment and the economic costs of rebuilding infrastructure destroyed during siege operations. These complaints rarely result in restrictions on Death Korps deployment, as the Militarum prioritizes military effectiveness over political considerations, but they create ongoing friction between military and civilian Imperial authorities. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains a complex relationship with Krieg based on fascination with the planet's Vidi womb technology and concern about the theological implications of mass-producing soldiers through artificial gestation. The tech priests who oversee the Vidi womb facilities on Krieg view the technology as a practical application of biological engineering that serves the Omnissiah's purpose by creating efficient tools for prosecuting the Imperium's wars. However, some factions within the Mechanicus question whether the extensive genetic modifications and psychological conditioning implemented during the gestation process violate the boundaries between acceptable enhancement and forbidden innovation. These debates remain largely theoretical, as the Mechanicus recognizes the strategic value of Death Korps forces and maintains its technical support for Krieg's recruitment infrastructure despite theological reservations. The Ecclesiarchy's internal debates regarding the Death Korps focus on whether the Krieg interpretation of Atonement represents genuine faith or a perversion of Imperial cult theology. The mainstream Ecclesiarchy teaches that the Emperor values humanity's devotion and that faithful service earns his protection and eventual reward in death. The Krieg version of the imperial cult instead presents the emperor as a stern judge who observes their efforts at redemption with cold calculation, measuring their sacrifices against the magnitude of their ancestors' rebellion. Some ecclesiarchy theologians argue that this interpretation fundamentally misunderstands the emperor's relationship with humanity, transforming him from a protective father figure into a harsh taskmaster whose forgiveness remains forever beyond reach. The Munitorum priests who serve on Krieg defend their theological position by pointing to the planet's history of rebellion and the nuclear devastation that resulted from the Civil War. They argue that Krieg's crime exceeded ordinary human failings and required extraordinary penance to expiate. The planet allowed traitors to seize control of its government and industries, threatening to deprive the Imperium of a productive world and potentially inspiring similar rebellions elsewhere. The 500-year siege and the ongoing sacrifice of Death Korps soldiers in Imperial service represent appropriate responses to this magnitude of sin, demonstrating Krieg's commitment to redemption through actions rather than empty words of contrition. The theological debate extends to the question of whether Krieg's debt can ever be truly repaid or whether the planet exists in a state of perpetual penance from which no escape is possible. The Krieg interpretation suggests that no finite amount of sacrifice suffices to balance the scales, that every Death Korps soldier who dies in Imperial service reduces the debt by an infinitesimal amount, but that complete redemption remains forever beyond reach. This position troubles some ecclesiarchy theologians who argue that it denies the emperor's capacity for forgiveness and transforms service to the Imperium into a futile exercise rather than a path toward salvation. The Munitorum priests counter that the uncertainty regarding redemption motivates Kriegers to maintain their extraordinary devotion, and that definitively declaring the debt repaid would undermine the psychological conditioning that makes Death Korps forces so effective. The psychological dimensions of the Krieg identity extend beyond simple military conditioning into a comprehensive worldview that shapes every aspect of how Kriegers understand their existence. The soldiers possess no concept of personal ambition or individual achievement, viewing themselves as components of a collective entity whose purpose involves serving the Imperium through military action. They form no lasting personal relationships, their interactions with fellow soldiers remaining purely functional exchanges focused on accomplishing assigned tasks. The absence of normal human emotional responses creates individuals who function efficiently in military contexts, but who would struggle to exist in civilian society, though this consideration holds no practical relevance since Kriegers never transition to civilian life. The question of whether Death Korps soldiers qualify as fully human by Imperial standards occasionally surfaces in administratum discussions, particularly when officials unfamiliar with Krieg observe their behavior for the first time. The genetic modifications implemented through the Vidi-Womb programs remain within acceptable parameters established by the Adeptus Mechanicus for enhanced soldiers, not crossing the boundaries into human territory. The psychological conditioning, while extreme, employs techniques approved by the Schola Progenium and similar to methods used in creating other specialized imperial forces. Nevertheless, some officials argue that the cumulative effect of these modifications creates individuals so far removed from baseline human psychology that they represent a distinct category requiring separate classification. The Inquisition maintains ongoing monitoring of Krieg to ensure that the planet's genetic modification programs do not drift into heretical territory or create populations vulnerable to chaos corruption. The Inquisitors assigned to this oversight find little evidence of chaos taint on Krieg, noting that the Death Korps conditioning actually provides some protection against certain forms of corruption. The soldiers' absence of fear makes them resistant to manipulation by demons that prey on terror, while their lack of ambition or desire eliminates vulnerabilities that Slaanesh might exploit. The complete subordination of individual will to collective purpose creates personalities with few psychological hooks that chaos entities could use to establish influence. However, the Inquisition remains vigilant for signs that Khorne might find the Death Korps' endless slaughter appealing, or that Nurgle could exploit their acceptance of death and decay. The future of Krieg in the era Indomitus following the Great Rift presents both challenges and opportunities for the Death World and its unique military culture. The massive warp storm that split the Imperium in half disrupted established supply routes and isolated entire sectors from Terra's authority, creating circumstances where the Adeptus Militarum desperately needs every available regiment to contain the countless threats emerging across Imperial space. The demand for Death Korps forces has increased dramatically, with requests for Krieg deployments coming from war zones across both sides of the Great Rift. The planet's Vidi Womb facilities operate at maximum capacity, producing soldiers at rates that strain even Krieg's extensive infrastructure, while still failing to meet the Munitorum's requirements. The Indomitus Crusade launched by Lord Commander Robute Guilliman incorporated several Death Korps regiments into its massive military formations, deploying them to some of the most contested battlefields in the Crusade's area of operations. The Death Korps forces participated in siege operations against chaos-held worlds in the Nachmund Gauntlet, the narrow corridor of stable warp routes connecting the two halves of the divided Imperium. The regiments conducted their characteristic methodical advances against fortified positions, accepting massive casualties while reducing enemy strongholds that blocked the Crusade's progress. Guilliman's strategic staff recognized the value of Death Korps forces for specific tactical situations, while also noting their limitations in the mobile warfare that characterized much of the Crusade's operations. The Primarch's personal observations of Death Korps forces in action generated mixed reactions, according to accounts from his staff officers. Guilliman acknowledged their effectiveness in siege warfare and their absolute reliability in executing orders regardless of circumstances, qualities that any commander would value in soldiers. However, he also expressed concern about the human cost of their operational methods and questioned whether the Imperium could sustain such losses across multiple theaters without depleting its military capacity to dangerous levels. The Primarch reportedly ordered his strategic planners to develop alternative approaches to siege operations that might achieve similar results with reduced casualties, though the practical implementation of such alternatives remains limited by the reality that conventional forces simply cannot match Death Korps' effectiveness in reducing heavily fortified positions. The introduction of Primaris Space Marines to Imperial military forces during the Indomitus Crusade created interesting dynamics when these enhanced Astartes operated alongside Death Korps regiments. The Primaris Marines, products of Archmagos, calls genetic engineering programs, represent humanity's finest warriors equipped with superior armor and weapons. Yet even these superhuman soldiers express something approaching respect for Death Korps' determination and effectiveness, noting that Krieg forces accomplish objectives through sheer bloody-minded persistence that compensates for their lack of enhanced physiology. The Space Marines observe that Death Korps soldiers function as force multipliers in siege operations, their willingness to accept casualties creating opportunities that even Astartes forces can exploit to achieve breakthrough against otherwise impregnable defenses. The strategic situation in the Imperium's darkest hour ensures that Death Korps regiments will remain in high demand for the foreseeable future. The emergence of the Great Rift unleashed demonic incursions across thousands of worlds, while Xenos threats including Orc-Waz, Tyranid Hive fleets, and Necron dynasties press against Imperial borders from every direction. The sheer scale of military operations required to contain these threats exceeds the Imperium's capacity to deploy conventional forces to every battlefield, creating circumstances where specialized regiments like the Death Korps provide critical capabilities that cannot be replicated through standard Imperial Guard formations. The continuing relevance of Krieg's unique military culture stems from the unfortunate reality that the Imperium faces countless situations requiring soldiers willing to die in large numbers to achieve strategic objectives. The reduction of chaos held fortress worlds, the clearance of orc-infested hive cities, the defense of critical industrial centers against overwhelming enemy attacks. These scenarios occur with depressing regularity across Imperial space, and they all benefit from the deployment of troops who view massive casualties as acceptable costs rather than outcomes to be minimized. The Death Korps fills this niche in Imperial military doctrine, providing forces optimized for the grinding attritional warfare that characterizes so many of the Imperium's conflicts. The long-term sustainability of Krieg's recruitment model faces questions as the planet's population endures centuries of constant warfare that consumes millions of lives annually. The Vidi Womb facilities operate continuously to replace losses and maintain the flow of new regiments to active war zones, but even this advanced technology has limits. The genetic diversity necessary to prevent degradation of the population requires periodic introduction of new genetic material, forcing Krieg to maintain a minimal civilian population for breeding purposes despite the inefficiency compared to pure vat growth. The planet's industrial infrastructure requires constant maintenance and occasional expansion to support increased production demands, consuming resources and labor that might otherwise support additional military recruitment. The Administratum projects that Krieg can sustain current recruitment rates for several more centuries before facing potential limitations, assuming no catastrophic damage to the planet's infrastructure or Vidi Womb facilities. This timeline provides adequate capacity to meet foreseeable military requirements, though it also highlights the finite nature of even Krieg's impressive recruitment capability. The Adeptus Archives maintains contingency plans for scenarios where Krieg production decreases, including identification of other worlds that might implement similar recruitment programs or development of alternative force structures that could substitute for Death Korps capabilities in specific tactical situations. The legacy of the Death Korps within Imperial military history will endure regardless of the planet's future trajectory. Krieg has demonstrated that human determination and willingness to sacrifice can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that properly conditioned and equipped soldiers can function effectively in environments that would kill conventional troops, and that the Imperium possesses the capacity to transform even catastrophic failure into eventual redemption through centuries of faithful service. The Death Korps represents both the heights of Imperial military effectiveness and the depths of human cost that the Imperium accepts to maintain its existence, embodying the fundamental truth that humanity's survival in the 41st millennium requires sacrifices that would be unthinkable in more civilized ages. The soldiers of Krieg march across countless battlefields, their gray greatcoats and rebreather masks marking them as harbingers of brutal siege warfare and attritional combat that grinds enemies into dust through sheer bloody persistence. They ask for no recognition, expect no reward beyond death in service to the Emperor, and maintain their grim determination regardless of casualties or circumstances. The Death Korps of Krieg stands as testament to humanity's capacity for both extraordinary devotion and terrible sacrifice, their existence a reminder that the Imperium's survival depends on citizens willing to give everything in service to a cause greater than any individual life. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, where humanity faces extinction from countless threats, the Death Korps continues its eternal penance through the only currency Krieg has ever offered, the lives of its sons and daughters, spent without hesitation in the Emperor's name.